That day it was a dark night in the mountains and black clouds covered the moon. Some strange sounds were heard between the trees in the forest, similar to the dying groans of a dying animal. There was a dead dog lying on the ground in the forest. Next to it there was a broken iron trap, but scratch marks were visible on the body of the dead animal, and this meant that the animal did not die because of the trap. Two people stood near the dead animals, looked at him with judgment, and they discussed the fact that it was some unusual animal that killed the dog. Suddenly, two guys ran up to them from behind and turned to the boss. They said that the noose and trap were still in their place. One of the guys gritted his teeth and said that he was absolutely sure that he had set the trap correctly, and the second guy shouted loudly that this animal must have been hurt, but there was not a single trace. The man turned his head back and turned to a guy named Man Sam. He said that this was the first time he had met such a beast and suggested leaving here as soon as possible. Man Sam narrowed his eyes, made a dissatisfied expression on his face, and ordered everyone to immediately shut up because I don't stop him from thinking. He focused his gaze on one point and thought that they were in a real trap. If his instincts were not deceiving him, then they were in a trap. If they moved now, then this beast could attack them, but they also could not remain idle. In the forest, the screams of people were heard constantly repeating one thing and not saying that it was time for them to leave here. Man Sam pointed his hand at his subordinates and said that they should leave the traps here, and tomorrow they will take them away. But now they should reach the valley and not go too far from each other. But suddenly, at that moment, something terrible happened. Some beast attacked one of his subordinates and tore his body like a rag in a matter of seconds, and they didn't even have time to react. Man Sam only noticed after a few seconds that drops of blood appeared on his face. He looked to the side and saw that his subordinate was lying on the floor and screaming in pain, and at that moment there was a large paw of some terrible beast on his body. A giant tiger appeared in front of them. It was incredibly large in size, emitting a strong blue aura, and its eyes glowed red. The hunters screamed in horror when they saw this monster and immediately grabbed their weapons. Man Sam also grabbed his crossbow and loaded an arrow to fire a shot. He tried to pull the arrows as hard as possible, but at that moment his crossbow jammed and he couldn't do it quickly and he was at a loss. The tiger was going to the hunter because he knew that in this battle, the strongest would survive and every mistake could be the last. So the tiger immediately attacked his opponent and made a rapid leap forward. A few seconds later, they saw the face of the sharp kitchen of a large monster and the blood that scattered in different directions. The silhouette of one of the hunters stood right in the middle of the forest. There was a white fog around him, but even through this fog, you could clearly see that he no longer had an arm. The hunter looked up at this monster and said that they had disturbed the one who should not have been touched, and unfortunately they had not decided to attack the master of this forest and the owner of this mountain. The hunter could not even imagine that their enemy would be such a big beast. He looked up at him and realized that this tiger was a real deity who was pouring out his anger on them. The tiger wasted his time and immediately attacked the last surviving hunter in order to finally put an end to his enemy. The scene of action is transferred to a quiet, calm village, which is located at the foot of the mountain. And in the center of this village, a river flows. There are very few people on the street in this village. Well, those people who are on the street are constantly discussing among themselves that today is the day. The man in the white hat told his friend that today is the day when the people from this village should make offerings to the owner of the mountain. His interlocutor closed his eyes and put a piece of fish in his mouth, after which he said that he completely forgot that this ceremony would take place tonight. The guy in the white hat curiously asked him who the victim would be this time, and the man, slowly moving his mustache and lips, said that Nobleman Beck was ready to sacrifice one of his slaves. He said that this slave would be a young girl, but she had beautiful white hair and blue eyes that looked like a ghost. It's already dark outside and the scene shifts to a building near which stands a man in a large black hat. Opposite him are two girls, a small girl who covered her head with a large shirt and an old woman who constantly nods her head. The gentleman pointed his hand at the old woman and said that she was doing well because she brought this little girl. Now the old woman can be free and the girl should go with him. The girl did not understand what was happening and was trembling with fear. She tried herself using a jacket, but it did not help. The man loudly shouted at her and said that she would make him very angry if she continued to stand still and not listen to his orders. They left the castle grounds and 4 men were already waiting for them near a portable cart. These men immediately greeted Mr. The gentleman ordered the men to take this girl to the right place and he stood and followed her with his eyes. The girl was inside this portable carriage and was shaking with fear all the time and clutching her dress with her hands. The sounds of some large beast were heard again in the mountains. The soldiers heard these terrible sounds. They felt terrified and scared because they were approaching closer and closer to the very place where the owner of the mountain is located. Sweat began to flow down their faces. They had already covered a large number of kilometers, and now was the most difficult phase because they had to lift this carriage to the top of the mountain. They wore special shoes that helped them climb to the top of the mountain. When they arrived at the place, they immediately looked at each other to understand whether they had done everything correctly. When they realized that this was the same place, they immediately threw this carriage to the ground, and it was very thunderous. As soon as the carriage was at the top of the mountain, and not immediately, they began to run away from here to far away so as not to personally meet this terrible beast. A lonely wooden carriage stood on the top of a mountain in complete darkness. Suddenly, the window of this carriage opened up. A small leg of young girls appeared from a wooden booth. She came out of this wooden cage and looked at the nature that surrounded her and saw big clouds and beautiful skies. Suddenly, she noticed that there was a large cave next to her and was surprised because she had never seen such large caves in her life. But suddenly, she closed her mouth because she reacted very loudly with words and called herself stupid, because you can't do that. She took her cape with her hand and thought that she would soon meet the owner of the mountain. She must behave with dignity. The girl clenched her fist and said that you need to behave with dignity and follow the measures. She didn't know what would actually happen here, but her grandmother told her that she should become the bride of the owner of the mountain. She extended her hand forward because it was very dark in the cave, and she moved by touch. She didn't see anything. She only heard sounds, but it was very quiet in this cave, so quiet that she could hear her breathing. She continued to walk forward in the dark by touch and thought that I was very scared of her and she could not go further. But suddenly she heard a loud, rude voice that asked her who she was. The girl was scared and didn't know what to answer, so she just kept walking forward. Suddenly she tripped and fell to her knees, hitting her knees on the floor. But the voice continued to persistently ask her who she was. The girl was terribly scared. She tried to say something, but she lost her breath from fear. She clenched her fist tightly and thought that she needed to pull herself together and still explain to him who she was. She raised her head up and said in an insistent voice that from now on she would honor the owner of the mountain as her husband, and her name was Choa, and welcomed her new husband. Tiger opened his eye and it began to glow red in this darkness. Chow was embarrassed. Her cheeks turned red. She got scared and thought that she had said too much. Suddenly, a huge beast came out of the darkness. It was so big that it resembled some kind of walking house. The animals came closer to her, and we began to sniff out her scent. And at that moment, the girl was sitting, and some bright glow appeared motionless between them. She bit her lip to feel the pain and stop being afraid. Chow stood up and shouted in a very loud voice that she had been warned that the first time always hurt, but she was told to endure it if she wanted to become the bride master of the mountain. She put her hand on her chest and said that from now on she completely belongs to the owner of the mountain, and again called him husband. But the tiger did not appreciate such a rude attitude towards himself and began to growl very loudly at her, and his eyes began to glow with a red flame. The girl thought that at that moment her life ended once and for all, so she closed her eyes so as not to see how she would die. But the tiger came closer to them and shouted in a very loud, dissatisfied, angry voice that she should get out of here and never come back again. HIV doesn't interest him in the nonsense she just said. This girl was shocked by the big tiger's words and couldn't believe that he would react like that to his new wife. She insisted in bewilderment for several seconds. Didn't even move. It seemed like she was just frozen, that's what she heard. But when it finally realized that this big beast had just shouted at her, she began to compress her lips. Immediately after this, she began to scream very loudly, and tears began to flow from her eyes. She cried loudly and could not stop. But the tiger didn't like it, and again in a rude voice asked her why the hell she was crying. But Chow couldn't answer him at that moment because she was very scared and busy with her tears. He started to get angry because he was annoyed by this little girl and ordered her to get out of here immediately. But this girl started crying again, and this time she cried even harder, and the snot coming out of her nose was screaming louder and louder. The tiger was furious with what he saw. He couldn't just stand there and watch this little girl. He fell to the floor and covered his head with his paws, after which he said that he hated the sound of someone crying. The tiger realized that this girl needed to be somehow calmed down and stopped. He asked her not to cry and asked why she was so upset, but she still continued to scream. Suddenly the girl stopped and looked at him with her blue eyes. She said that she was very offended by the fact that she was his fiancée and he was kicking her out. The tiger took a very deep breath and realized that he needed to make a decision on what to do with this girl. He wiped her tears with his claw and said that it was already dark outside and he would allow her to spend the night in his cave, and the girl immediately calmed down and smiled. At that moment, he tried really hard to scare her with his terrible expression on his face. But this didn't scare her at all, and she just came closer to him and hugged his paw with her small hand. She was so happy that she could spend the night in his cave that she left her snot on his paw. He raised his paw up and didn't like that his paw was all dirty with snot. The morning came and the sun was shining brightly in the sky. The first rays of the sun entered the cave and began to illuminate it. Chow lay on the tiger and slept. She hugged him with her small arms. Tag woke up a long time ago but still didn't get up because he knew that a little girl was sleeping on him and didn't want to wake her up. He was lying there. I thought that she had been sleeping for a very long time and he should have woken her up and kicked her out of here long ago. He thought about her appearance. He thought that she was a haired girl with blue eyes, and there were very few people in the world with such appearance. She thought that she had white blood, and the curse of unknown creatures was hung on her, and she also became one of them. And this little child will become a terrible creature over which everyone will shake with fear, but her blood will be a real elixir that nothing can compare with. The tiger thought that they would all come for her, and she was much more dangerous than he thought, and therefore he couldn't keep her. He felt that the girl began to wake up and immediately looked at her. She slowly opens her eyes. Chow immediately took the tiger's paw with her small hand and asked him if he was awake. She said in a surprised, joyful voice that she and the tiger spent the night together, and this means that they are officially husband and wife. But her words angered him again, and he stood up on his paws and said in a dissatisfied voice that the sun had already risen and she needed to leave here. But she replied that she could not leave because she was told that if she did not become his bride, she would be punished. The tiger asked her who dared to do this and who even came up with this stupid plan. The girl answered saying that it was all invented by the nobleman Beck and his son, and he was surprised. He concluded that those bandits were sent here by the same person, and it turns out that this is the girl they sacrificed. Chow, in a small, pitiful voice, asked him not to leave her. She said that she knows how to do laundry very well and eats absolutely everything, and she copes well with any task. He thought that if he sent her back to the village, she would be kicked out and die. He closed his eyes and realized that he needed to think carefully about what to do in this situation. But suddenly he came up with a solution and his ear went up. He thought that he could send her to another village, and if he also gave her some useful medicinal herbs, then perhaps she would survive. He ordered her to follow him and after some time brought her medicinal herbs. He threw this grass on the ground along with some roots. Chow looked at him in surprise and asked what it was and why he brought it here. The tiger said that he was giving her this ginseng, and now she should take it and go not to the village of Beck, but to the village of Ongol. Chow didn't understand what kind of nonsense he just said, because she was his fiancée and said that she couldn't leave him. He got angry and said that she should stop repeating the same thing and explained to her that he could not be her husband either, because he was a big tiger and she should do what he said. He moved these medicinal herbs closer to her with his tail and said that if she sold them, she could buy a small house and still have money left over. Chow picked up these roots of medicinal herbs and said that she did not need anything from what he listed because she only needed him. But suddenly she saw something very scary and immediately fell silent and her small mouth opened in fear. The tiger radiated his powerful, scary energy and asked her to leave here as soon as possible and not make him angry. He shouted loudly that he was the owner of Mount Back and was doomed to be alone forever, and after these words, he slowly went into the cave. But at that moment she called him again and called him husband. He turned his head at her, and with an angry look again ordered her to leave here. She told her husband in a trembling, frightened voice that she would not be able to go down, and she did not know where the village of Ongol was. He looked at her for a few seconds, and thought about what he should do, and suddenly realized that he had nothing to do today, and he could help her. He bent down in front of the day and ordered her to sit astride him and said that she should do it right away because he wouldn't repeat it a second time. She put the roots and herbs into her cloak and tied it around her chest, making a bag out of it. After that, she grabbed his eyebrow with her hand in order to climb on him. She started to climb on top of him and we had to endure it because there was no other choice. At that moment, he was thinking only about one thing. Why didn't she climb on his side and decided to climb right on his head? When she climbed onto his back, she immediately began to look around her. Chow said in a very loud voice that it was very beautiful here, and she had never seen this place from such a height. Chow immediately began to wave her arms and rejoice because she is the first one to sit on the tiger's neck like this, but the little Adam began to anger him. She pointed her hand forward and ordered him to go full speed ahead, and again called him her husband. The tiger made a rapid leap forward, and after that jumped down from the cliff, and in flight said that he didn't like it when she called him that, and asked her to stop doing it. The tiger stopped a few kilometers from the village, after which he showed the girls this settlement and said that she needed to go there. But Chow said that these two mountains look like butt. She constantly pulled him with her hands without his ears in different directions and asked her not to do that again, because his ears already hurt. She removed her hands from his ears and asked for forgiveness. She said that it was not on purpose. Then she froze for a few seconds and began to examine him. Suddenly, she grabbed him by the neck with both hands and began to hug him very tightly. But he said that he didn't like it when she stuck to him like that, and ordered him to quickly go downstairs. Chow rolled down her butt like on a big slide and calmly landed on the ground. He slowly began to move his ears and said goodbye that, surprisingly, he was a little interested in spending time with her. But she had already managed to milk him and said that he never wanted to see her again. But Chow was ready to let him go just like that and immediately grabbed his big tail and started dearly. She said that she didn't understand where her husband was going to go. He started screaming in pain and immediately said that pulling animals by the tail is a great sin and you can't do that. Chow replied that she knew all this very well, but she was going to leave her fiancé, so she had no other choice. The tiger again shouted that she was not his bride and went crazy because she didn't understand that a tiger and a man couldn't get married. But Chow said that they spent the night together, and that's why she became his bride. She screamed that she didn't want to hear anything, and she married him, and therefore he should be responsible for her. The tiger at that moment turned pale and sweated. He said that for her sake he found ginseng, and told her that she should sell it and live for herself in the human world and do not deny herself anything. But she threw a bag of ginseng on the floor and said that she didn't want to live on her own, and said that if he wasn't around, she didn't need this useless herb. The tiger at that moment realized that the girl did not realize how expensive this grass was, and realized that it wouldn't end just like that, and he didn't want to do it. But there was no other choice, and he would have to do it. He suddenly calmed down and said that she should go to that village and sell ginseng, and after that come back and bring money because she should pay his dowry. The girl was surprised and opened her eyes wide. Her cheeks immediately became red. She immediately began to glow and smile. She asked him not to go anywhere because she would return quickly. He was finally able to exhale and calm down and asked her not to rush into selling the weed. But the girl no longer heard anything and simply ran towards the village holding a bag of grass in her hands. But suddenly she tripped and fell, hitting her face on the ground. The tiger asked her to go more carefully, watch porn. The girl immediately said that it happened by accident and she wouldn't fall again. She moved her small legs very quickly and ran towards the village, but her strength still slowly faded into the distance. The tiger followed her with his gaze and all this time stood and watched her leave. In the village there was a trauma store near which a grandfather was sitting and cooking something near the fire. Grandfather saw a girl in front of him who said that she wanted to sell him something very important. He raised his head and looked at this girl. At that moment the grandfather was scared because in front stood a girl who looked like a ghost with white hair and blue eyes. Grandfather was so scared that he jumped back and fell to the ground. He was so scared that he even started screaming. But he took a closer look at this girl, scratched his beard, and said that he thought that a ghost had appeared in front of him. And after that, he cleared his throat and asked her what she had come to sell. She took ginseng root out of her bag and showed him her ingredient for sale. The old man could not believe his eyes because the same ginseng was now in front, and he immediately asked her where she found it. Chow answered her grandfather that her husband gave her this root and asked her to sell it so that she could pay the dowry. Grandfather began to carefully examine this root and said that it looked about 300 years old, and this child clearly did not know the value of this item. He looked at this girl carefully and thought that she looked very stupid, and he would not be able to easily take her into account. He hatched terrible plans to deceive her and get this expensive root for just a couple of coins. Chow said that she wants to get money for this root as soon as possible and return back to her husband. Grandfather sighed heavily and thought that he had just wanted to deceive a small child, and this was a terrible act. He came closer to her and said that he could not buy such an expensive product from her, and she needed to go to Kim's house because rich people live there, and she must tell them that grandfather said this is real ginseng. She bowed to him and immediately ran away. The sounds of a tiger eating something were heard in the cave. He dined on fresh game he had recently caught and said that nothing compares to the emotions he gets when one rips meat off a bone. He tried to separate the meat from the bones and said that the fault lies with the one who was deceived, and one cannot be stupid. It is unforgivable for this world. If you think like that, then he is the victim. Suddenly, he stopped and thought about the fact that he lived for himself and didn't bother anyone, and then some girl almost took away all his peace. But the worst thing is if she comes here with money. Here. He started waving his head in different directions and thought that it made sense to move to some other cave so that she wouldn't find him. But then he thought that this was some kind of stupidity. The owner of Back Mountain must move somewhere because of some little girl. But suddenly he heard a strange voice that appeared from the bottom, where this voice asked him if he was worried, and the tag replied that he was not worried about this girl. But the voice told him that no one asked him about the girl, and the tiger, licking his paw, said that he was worried about his ginseng. A new voice told him that people are disgusting and they will definitely use dirty methods to get ginseng, and perhaps they will beat her and take it away. I suddenly realized that she could be killed even for spreading rumors throughout the village that she had such an expensive item. The gentleman at that moment took a spoonful of rice with meat and put it in his mouth. Suddenly someone called him very loudly and came into his room, from which the gentleman got angry and hit the table with a spoon. He said that he had warned him more than once not to be disturbed when he was eating. But a subordinate came into his room and said that his uncle, the doctor, had sent something for them to sell ginseng. And at that moment, he was shown real ginseng of enormous size, which makes you look perfect. The gentleman could not believe his eyes because he had never seen anything like this before. And this ginseng was incredibly good. The ginseng that was in this girl's hands glowed with its perfection. The gentleman thought that he had never seen such a large size of this root and did not understand how such a value ended up in the hands of a child. The girl looked at him with her blue angelic eyes and didn't even understand what this gentleman was thinking about now. He scratched his mustache and beard and looked at this girl, and then asked her if she was the same slave of the bake house. She was surprised when she heard this question and asked her uncle how he knew this. He narrowed his eyes and got angry at her because he realized that this girl was saying that this woman didn't steal everything somewhere. But after that, he got even angrier and asked this little world why she was still alive. Because the owner of the mountain should have eaten her yesterday, and started shouting at her because she ran away. He shouted at her and said that she stole this ginseng, but Chow said that her gay husband gave this root so that she could sell it. But the gentleman did not understand what she was talking about and what kind of husband she was talking about, because she had not grown up to the age of marriage, and again called her a thief and ordered her to take away the ginseng. At that moment, a guard approached her and extended his hand forward to take the root from her. She began to cry and held this root with all her might so as not to give it to him, and said that this root should not be taken away from her. Her husband gave it to her. But at that moment the guard was surprised because this girl didn't even move after he touched her, and most likely she has some kind of power. He got angry and hit her with his club with all his strength and threw it aside. The gentleman at that moment looked at her in surprise and said that she was a real scoundrel, and he wanted to let her go on good terms if she gave him the stolen ginseng. But now it won't be possible to do that, and he ordered her to carry the straw. But Chow didn't understand why I didn't treat her so badly, and said that she was telling them the truth, and at that moment she started crying. But the guard didn't care about her tears, and he swung his straw to strike. She moved slowly with her legs, and constantly cried. She said that she was in a lot of pain, and she didn't know what to do, because the ginseng that her husband gave her was taken away from her. She was sobbing, and drops of blood were flowing down her face from open wounds. She was afraid that her husband would be offended by her because she had lost her roots. But when she came to the place where he was supposed to wait for her, he was not there, and she was surprised because he had disappeared somewhere. She didn't understand what was happening and why he wasn't in this place. She started turning her head around, trying to find him somewhere nearby, and screamed very loudly, trying to call him. She ran in the direction from which they had not come in order to catch up with him, and constantly talked about the fact that his wife Chow had already arrived. She quickly moved her legs and ran, but she lost her shoe. Because of this, it was difficult for her to move quickly. At some point, she stopped and felt danger. She felt scary, but she saw you approaching in the distance. At first, she thought it was her mouse, but when she looked closer, she realized that these were the shadows of some animals with red eyes that wanted to eat her. When they came out of the forest, it turned out that these were not animals, but some terrible creatures. Chow didn't understand what to do and just continued to stand still and look at them. And at that moment, the monsters immediately jumped on her and extended their hands forward to grab her and tear her apart. She saw their fingers approaching her and understood that they would kill her now, but she could not protect herself, so she was preparing for death. The monster opened his terrible big mouth with sharp teeth and looked at her with his terrible red eyes. He wanted to eat her, but suddenly this monster was torn into two halves with one blow. He appeared behind her, the same tiger and owner of the mountain, and in a rough, terrible voice, He said that not one empty soul like this monster has the right to touch her, Vitya. She belongs to him. After that, he opened his mouth wide and began to growl very loudly, and this roar scared away all the monsters and made them fly back into the forest. Chow couldn't believe that he appeared at the very moment when she was needed most, and she felt much better, and she stopped being afraid. He looked at her face and saw that her whole face was covered in abrasions and bruises. He asked her who dared to do this to her, but the girl still didn't understand what was happening and just stood silently and looked at him. She raised her head up and looked at her big tiger husband. He asked her to immediately say who dared to hit her and raise his vile hand on this sweet, angelic creature. She touched him with her small hand and grabbed him by the fur that was on his paw. She didn't say anything and just silently looked at him, and a tear flowed out of her eyes. She stood next to him, Nika, and at that moment he was thinking about how he would deal with these cruel people. In the evening, the master threw a bag of coins on the floor in front of the servant. The gentleman smiled and said that the guy did a good job and he managed to kick her out and take the ginseng. The servant smiled and said that the master need not worry because he put his guys on guard. If suddenly someone comes, he will not be able to enter the building. The gentleman was completely engrossed in the roots and said that the guy had done a good job and now he can go. The servant left the building with a bag of coins in his hand and said that with this money he could rest for several months, and decided that now he would go to a restaurant and have fun with some girls. But suddenly he saw some strange light in front of him and stopped to look at it carefully. But this color was very bright, and on the contrary, cracks began to appear on the building. Suddenly, there was a very strong explosion, and he flew back after something incomprehensible exploded in front of him. The gates of the building along with the fence were destroyed after this explosion. He saw the silhouette of a girl standing in front of him. Her face was not visible because there was a white fog ahead. He said that no one has the right to enter the owner's building, much less break the gate. But in front of them stood this very girl whom the servant had kicked out a few hours ago, and they did not understand what she was doing here again. He got angry and called her a stupid girl, asked if she wasn't afraid to go back again, and said that she had received few blows, and this time she definitely wanted to die. But suddenly a huge tiger appeared behind her. It was the same owner of the mountain who said that it was definitely not her who would die here today, and after that he began to growl. The guards turned pale with fear. They couldn't believe their eyes, because that same legendary beast was now standing in front of them, and when they saw it in person, they were ready to fall underground because it was the size of a house. The gentleman heard some strange noise in his yard and immediately opened the front door to see what was happening there. He was very unhappy, and in an angry voice asked who was making noise in his yard at night. But at that moment, the body of one of the guards flew near his face and broke his front door. He turned his eyes back to look at his partner who was flying near his face. He saw that this guy hit his back against the wall and a large crack appeared in the wall. In front of them stood a large angry tiger who asked in a dissatisfied voice why this was not the same bastards who dared to hit this little girl. The gentleman was incredibly scared, but most of all, he couldn't believe that the same tiger was now standing in front of him. He continued to slowly move his paws and walk forward. He said that he didn't act like real weaklings gathered in a bunch and together bullied a little girl. He looked at them with his demonic gaze and asked if this was all they were capable of. He opened his big mouth and showed them his teeth, after which he showed that they were just a pile of garbage that needed to be disposed of. The servant jumped back and in a frightened voice asked for mercy and said that he had confused them with someone. He swung his paw and extended his claws and said that he would return to them what they did to this girl. But Chow suddenly extended her small hand and asked her husband to wait and not do this. She stopped in front of the body of this vile guard and blocked him with her body. Chow was very scared and said that she didn't want him to kill anyone because of her, and suggested just returning the ginseng and leaving here. But the tiger was already very angry, and he wanted to take revenge on them in his own way. But when he looked into her innocent blue eyes, he couldn't resist her. He had to stop for a moment and scratch his head in order to understand what to do next. Suddenly the tiger turned to this vile guard and he asked in a frightened voice what this great owner of the mountain wants. The tiger ordered this vile man to immediately bring ginseng, which was not taken from the girl. The owner brought him ginseng and said that here is everything that the little girl brought them, and they give them everything only with a request to be left alive. The owner said that he protected him and watched over him so that nothing happened to him. But he shouted very loudly and ordered him to immediately shut up and close his mouth once and for all, because he is now blatantly lying. The owner began to cry and begged for mercy and begged not to be killed. But the tiger said that if it had been his will, he would have torn off this pathetic man's dirty skin from his face. But now he saved him from the child. But the tiger didn't want to just leave it all and ordered the gentleman to give up all his wealth. And if the gentleman lies to him, and there is at least one coin or one crumb left, he will soon regret it. He opened his mouth and said that if he deceives the tiger now, then in the future his life will be over. The owner began to shout in a frightened voice that he would immediately bring everything. He raised his head in fear and called all his servants to bring his wealth, and after that they delivered all the wealth to Back Mountain. After these words, the tiger disappeared somewhere. He made a swift dash and disappeared like a ghost. The gentleman at that moment was completely pale. His blood all went to his heels from fear, and thus the ears to which he spoke were the tiger sang himself Gong, the guardian of the mountain. The next day in the cave, you could hear some things being brought. The tiger lay on the ground and thought that he didn't understand how all this could happen to him. He looked at the cave and saw a bunch of unnecessary rubbish along with the animal, and all this turned his cozy nest into some kind of human den. Chow took the small berry in her fingers and told her husband that she had found a wild raspberry. She fed him this raspberry and tried to stuff it into his mouth and said that she wanted to know how it tasted to him. She smiled and laughed and said that Marina was very tasty and hoped that he liked it. He thought that he had brought her back, but nothing had changed at all and began to leave, but she did not understand where he was going to go. The tiger said that he was going to drink water, and Chow said that now she also really wants water and would start living after him. They walked slowly along the forest in search of a pond of water. She was sweating because they had been walking for a very long time and tugged at his paw with her hand, asking her husband how long he would have to walk. He led her to the very place where the water was and said that they had already arrived at that moment. She said that it was very beautiful here. A golden fish appeared from the water and said that she had not seen the guardian of the mountain for a long time, and said that when they arrived, her life immediately improved. Chow was delighted because she had never seen a talking fish, but this fish could also fly. The tiger asked the fish to give him something that he had left with her for a long time, and the fish asked if he really wanted to give it to his bride, but he asked her to stop talking about it. The fish immediately listened to his order and opened its mouth to pull out some object. The tiger looked at the girl and asked her to open the cow, but she did not understand why she should do this. Chow approached the box, opened it, and the box began to glow pink. He pulled out a pink hairpin from the box that sparkled very brightly and said that it was a very beautiful hairpin. The tiger came closer to her, bowed his head, and said that this hairpin was carved from a Persian tree that is more than 1,000 years old and has the ability to ward off evil spirits, so she should always carry it with her. Chow was moved when she heard this and asked him if he was ready to give the hairpin to her. He replied that he definitely wouldn't wear it, and therefore from now on this hairpin belongs to her. She became emotional when she heard this, and tears began to appear in her eyes. The tiger didn't understand what happened and asked her what happened again and why she was crying. Chow stood in front of him and held a hairpin in her hands. She said that this was the first time she was given something for nothing. He took this hairpin in his hand and began to examine it. She said that this was her first gift in her life. Chow put this hairpin to her heart and said that she would treasure this gift for the rest of her life. Chow did not let go of the hairpin that Tig gave her. She slept very soundly and hugged him with her arms and legs, holding him by the fur, but she did not let go of the hairpin for a second. The tiger looked at her and couldn't understand how she could sleep for so long and constantly say something in her sleep. He stood up very abruptly and threw her off his body. He didn't understand when he even managed to lie down next to him. Chow looked at him and began to yawn. She asked him when he managed to wake up, but she still wanted to sleep. He said that they were not going on a long journey, and she should get ready as soon as possible, and said that he would not explain to her where they were going because she still did not know this place, but she should take with her as many valuable things as possible. Chow took the bag in her hands and walked up to the chest with money and began to look at her jewelry. She looked carefully at the treasure and thought that she needed to take something, but she didn't know what exactly. The tiger heard a voice inside himself, and this voice said that this girl's destiny was to become his bride, but the tiger did not agree with this. I did not want to get involved in her fate. The tiger did not agree with this voice and said that a person should have a human destiny, and it is very different from him because he is an animal. And besides, it is enough for him that the inner voice gets him. But the inner voice again said that before he didn't hate the word fate, but now he often uses this word. And the tiger replied that she remained as grumpy as she was despite the passing years. At that moment, she began to mock him jokes. The older you get, the more you start singing, and this angered him. The tiger began to get angry and growl and thought that this voice was already starting to infuriate him. But suddenly Chow appeared in front of him and said that she had packed all her things and was ready to leave. He moved his paw very quietly and did not create any unnecessary noise. It was a black panther as large in size as the owner of the tiger mountain, but this panther had a scar on his left eye. This scar was from the claws of some large monster, but despite this scar, the panther still had an eye. Walking next to this panther was a tall girl in black clothes and a red shirt. They entered the cave and were surprised when they saw that there was no one here, and the panther asked the girl if they had really come to the very place she was talking about. The girl replied that this was exactly the place where they were supposed to get to the panther, and asked why the owner of Mount Sang was not here, Guna. The panther suggested that he could just run away because he was afraid of them, but then he thought it was very strange. The girl said that if this is not so, then why is he not in his own mind and where could he go in this case? The panther was happy with this option, and he was happy when he heard all this, and began to say that the cowardly tiger just got scared and was cleaning up, and the girl asked the panther if he wanted to go back and forth. But he, like a little kitten, began to play on a big stone and said that he likes it here and wants to stay here and wait for this tiger to come here someday, and here it's at least warm and cozy. The panther continued to play and said that he wanted to look at the face of this tiger when he saw you here, but the girl asked this panther not to laugh in such a stupid voice. An old man and a child walked along a mountain path and headed to the other side of the mountain. There was a very strong wind that made the trees sway from side to side. But suddenly a huge tiger appeared on the ramp in front of them. The old man and the child stopped and looked at him in surprise. The old man pushed the child back with his hand and asked him not to move until the tiger left. The tiger looked at this old man with his hunter's gaze and froze for a moment. The grandfather understood that he would hurt the child if a dangerous moment occurred. He would fight this monster. But suddenly he looked at the head of this tiger and saw a little girl sitting astride him. Grandfather was very surprised when he saw this girl on the neck of this big tiger. He didn't understand what was happening here. But Chow was not taken aback when she saw their frightened faces and greeted the grandfather and the child who was next to him. The child looked at this girl with white hair and waved his hand at her in greeting. The girl told her old teacher that it was a girl sitting on the tiger's neck and asked her grandfather to watch them. But the tiger didn't like that they were staring at them and examining them. At night it was quiet in the forest and practically no noise was heard, and the deer could calmly eat the grass. But suddenly they did not hear some strange noise not far from them and raised their heads up. Suddenly a huge tiger jumped out behind a tree, opened its large mouth and swung its paws to catch its prey. The tiger caught the young deer in its mouth and began to run back to the place where he instructed Chow. He held the dead body of a deer in his teeth and thought that he didn't understand why he had to constantly share his prey. And it infuriated him, but he thought that he didn't have to wait long, and there was very little left to the village of Huajiang. He brought the body of a deer to the ground and said that this was their dinner for today, and Chow said in a joyful voice that he returned very quickly, and she did not expect that he would cope with the hunt so well. She looked at him with admiration and said that she thought that among the tigers he had the most excellent hunting skills. But the tiger doesn't understand why she is so delighted now, because it was a very easy task. But then he thought that these words flattered him, and even liked it when she praised him and said that there was nothing that he could not get. He tore her a piece of meat and said that she could start having dinner. Chow looked at him with a surprised look and said that she couldn't eat raw meat because she was not an animal. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really didn't know how to make a fire and fry meat, and Chow said that she had never done that. But fortunately, next to them was the same old man with the child whom they had seen during the day, and this old man said that they most likely needed help and they could share their fire with them. Chow was happy when she saw these cute guys and said that I was very pleased that they were ready to share with them, and said that she would also share meat with them. The tiger at that moment was lying not far from them and was cutting up the carcass of a dead deer from a thunderstorm, pieces of meat from its flesh. He carefully watched these people and thought that she just needed to bring fire here, but for some reason she had been next to these people for a very long time. He saw that the man never leaves his face with a smile, and these little people always amuse him. He didn't understand what these two were talking about, but it was clear from their faces that they liked being around each other. A piece of meat was roasting on the fire, and the smell of this meat spread throughout the forest. Chow hasn't eaten normally tasty food for a very long time, so when she looked at this piece of meat, her drool began to flow out. The tiger used its claws to pick out meat from its fangs and asked the girl what they had been talking about for so long. Chow said that that boy was the same age as her and that's why they decided to be friends, and his name is Bichong. He asked her in a surprised voice if his name was Bichong, but she had no time for that anymore because her stomach was grumbling very much from hunger, and he said that she was very hungry. Chow felt awkward, and she said that if he was also hungry, than she could share with him. He didn't understand why she was saying this. She was very hungry herself, and he heard a wail that was in her stomach. But she got angry and said that her living thing did not look like a whale, and that this whale was in the stomach of the shooting range. He started licking her paw and said that hunger went straight to her head, and there was nothing shameful here. She started to get angry again, even angrier, and said that he was wrong and this is not how it all works at all. But the tiger answered her that he was not deaf. He heard her stomach growling, and it was just the two of them, and he had good hearing to distinguish the sound from his stomach and the sound of someone else's stomach. But at that moment she began to get angry and her cheeks turned red. She took this large piece of meat by the bone and lifted it up, thereby removing it from under the fire. She began to offend the side of the forest and said that he was a real fool and did not understand anything at all. Well, the tiger actually did not understand what was happening to her. He saw her silhouette going deeper into the forest and holding a large piece of meat in her hand. He again heard a voice in his head that said that he couldn't understand the feeling of the little girl, and didn't he really want to follow her because it was dark and dangerous there? But the tiger said that the hairpin would protect her. He started licking his paw again, but the voice said that evil spirits would not touch her. But in the forest, if there is a worse creature, maybe she will get lost and something happened to her, and the tiger said that this is her fate. But the voice did not stop talking and left behind him, and for the last time said that apparently when she died, it was also her fate. But the tiger did not understand why this voice inside him cared so much about this little girl. But the voice answered that the tiger cannot be honest with himself. Suddenly, the same old man appeared from the forest, and this time his face was seriously upset, and there was a katana in his hand. The tiger stood up and looked at this old man in surprise. He did not understand what this grandfather wanted from him. The old man replied that he came to the Conrun Mountains, and the old man saw a ghost who was next to the tiger. The historian explained that the ghost who was previously a man but was killed by the tiger and does not leave him, bewitches other people and leads them to the tiger. He looked at this old man and thought that the mountain he was talking about was the place where people were very sensitive to the topic of ghosts. Next to the body of the tiger, there were girls who emitted black-purple pulses of energy similar to fog or smoke. The old man put his katana forward and said that he puts the honor of the warrior Conryun, I promise to cut his throat out. The tiger slowly began to approach him and told his spirit Hwarang that this all happened because of her, and now she must cope on her own. The old man saw that he was leaving him and leaving the battlefield, but the spirit of this girl still remained flying in the air in front. She touched her green medallion, which was on her neck, with her hand and said that she would be the one to go through it in this battle. From this small medallion, she began to pull out her sword in order to fight this old man. Every second this month became larger and larger, and it was unclear how she could pull out such a large object from such a small medallion. The old man was shocked when he saw what the girl was doing. He saw her necklace and thought that absolutely everything could be put there, regardless of size. The girl stood in front of him and looked very dangerous. She could control her medallions, but most importantly, she could control this big tiger. The old man said that before the battle begins, he wants to ask her something and find out what it is. She looked at him silently and thought whether to answer this question or just ignore him. But she still decided to answer and said that people who learn martial arts become too self-confident, and once he pulled out a dream, the conversations are over. She angered the old man because he didn't think that the ghost standing in front of him could speak so impudently. The old man immediately used his dragon art technique and split into 3 halves, trying to attack her from different sides. He was approaching her closer and closer, and his sword was almost near her head. But she suddenly turned her gaze to the side and lunged sharply to the right side. With this lunge, she was able to block his sword strike with her sword. He couldn't believe his eyes because this ghost was able to repel his dragon technique, and few people managed to do this. She asked him how he could treat a girl so rudely, but nevertheless, since he had already done it, she should pay him with a worthy blow. She immediately decided to counterattack her opponent and made a rapid dash forward. The old man was shocked when he saw this and did not understand what to do. He thought that he would kill her with the first attack. She delivered a powerful blow with her sword and attacked the old man. He was barely able to parry the blow and jump back. He raised his hand up, and in this hand he held a sword. His hand shook after this blow. She immediately struck again with another blow from above. The old man saw the sword approaching his face. It seemed to him that at that moment he could not cope. But still, he was able to deflect this blow and block it with his katana. He saw how her blades and swords were approaching his face and thought that just a little more, and he would definitely die. He had no other choice, and he used the art of the dragon to evade this blow and divided his body into several parts. She asked him where he was constantly running away and why he didn't want to fight like a real warrior. But the old man at that moment tried to get around her and strike from behind. But she understood his tactics and did not allow him to do this, so she swung her sword and threw him aside. The boy got scared when he saw this, and in a very loud, frightened voice shouted to the teacher that he should be more careful. The old man stuck his sword into the ground and leaned on it. He thought that this was impossible, and now he was losing to an ordinary ghost, and he could never believe that this happens in real life. He raised his head and looked up at her. He hoped that this ghost would calm down and stop attacking him. But when he saw her, he realized that she was swinging her weapon in order to deliver the final blow, and at that moment he thought that she might not be a ghost at all. Chow at that moment was sitting somewhere in the forest hiding everyone, and finishing a piece of meat that she fried over a fire and took with her. The tiger approached her and asked her if she liked the meat and whether it was delicious to cook. She turned her head at him and, chewing the meat, looked dissatisfied with her eyes so that he would understand that he was behaving incorrectly. He began to worry about her and said that it was very cold here, and it was better for him to go closer to the fire so that she would not freeze. But nevertheless, he was very surprised because her appetite was no worse than his. She pressed her lips with displeasure, and it was clear from her face that she didn't like something. She turned her head away from him and showed with all her appearance that she was very offended. The tiger had not communicated with little girls for a long time. I did not understand what her behavior meant. But he was not going to play with her, go out of childish games, and said that everything was clear to him, and since she was behaving like this, she could move on her own and live a happy life. But he was not very pleased with all this, and he would quickly forget about her. But the girl was not ready for him to behave like that and looked at him in surprise because she understood that I couldn't let him go. She ran after him and asked him to stop and go with her and not leave her in this forest. He continued to walk forward. He looked at her and thought that everything always happens like this because she's just an ordinary child. But suddenly he stopped and turned pale. He felt something very strange in his back paw. At that moment, Chow accidentally bumped her head into his paw and became very painful. She held the skid with her hand and said that she was in a lot of pain and perhaps she had broken her nose, and then asked why she became. The tiger asked her to be as quiet as possible and not do anything, and he began to slowly walk forward. He stepped forward and in a quiet, calm voice ordered the creature that was hiding from them to come out. Well, in front of them there was just grass. Apparently there was no one, and it was unclear who the tiger was communicating with. The girl was very scared because she didn't understand what kind of monster he saw there, and hid behind his back so that it wouldn't be so scary. Neza, some voice told the tiger that he didn't want to talk much and ordered him to put the girl and walk as far as possible, and if he leaves this girl here on his own, in that case he will stop playing. But the owner of the mountain was not going to just leave it, and he realized that a black soul was communicating with him because it was his territory. The tiger knew that this would happen to them someday, but he didn't expect it to happen so quickly. But the girl didn't hear their conversation and didn't understand what was happening. The tiger began to growl and clench his fangs. He understood that I might now have to fight, but he would like to solve this problem without a fight. Suddenly the tiger said that the black soul promised not to touch him if he gave up this girl, and he thought to himself that he needed to survive. The black soul told him that the tiger knows his place, and the black soul will keep his promise if he leaves her here and disappears. Chow didn't understand how she could be ready to put her here with this incomprehensible monster and why he was doing this. The tiger looked at her and ordered her to immediately let go of his paw and move away. But the girl didn't understand what was happening, and she asked if it was all because she was angry with him and promised that she would never do that again. The tiger asked her to be quiet and asked her if she really wanted him to die with her. He said that he had become attached to her lately, but not so much as to die with her. He pulled his paw out, and her fingers let go of him. He said that she must accept her fate. Chow didn't understand what was happening and looked at him with wide, frightened eyes, hoping that he was just joking. She watched as he walked away into the corner of the forest and absolutely did not turn his head back and did not look at her. Suddenly the girl heard a strange noise behind her and realized that it was the same monster that was hiding in the grass. Behind her was a huge monster who said that now it would eat a little girl with white blood flowing in her. At that moment, in another place, there was a battle between the old man and the ghost, and the old man saw her sword in front of his face. She asked him if he understood where his place was and said that she would not ask him to believe her, but he should know that they do not want to harm that girl. After these words, she removed the sword from his face, and the old man was finally able to calmly exhale and calm down. He lowered his head and said that even if he didn't believe that he could do it, he still had to believe. She smiled when she looked at him and said that if he understood everything, it's good, and there is nothing more stupid than not knowing his place. And after that, she asked what he was doing here with this child. The old man looked at her with a dissatisfied look and said that he and his student were spiritually training. She said that here you can find something that you won't find anywhere else. The old man slowly began to get to his feet and said that this was all right, and that's why I didn't come here, because they believed the rumors. He said that since ancient times, many people have been dying in these places. She became interested in this information and said that it was very interesting and asked him to continue. He said that all the corpses were without infinities. They cut the skin of the abdomen as if they wanted to find something there. She continued to look at him with interest, trying to understand what he now wants to tell her next. But her curiosity immediately changed and her gaze was frightened because she felt something very strange. The old man also stopped telling this story and his pupils narrowed very much and his face turned pale. The two of them raised their heads up and saw green smoke that appeared in the center of the forest and realized that this was a very bad sign. She said something very terrible happened, and she was here for a very long time and did not watch the tiger and that girl. The black spirit took out his great sword and cut the grass with the blade of this weapon, and then said that today he would drink white blood. He looked terrible and looked like a living corpse that had been lying on the ground for a very long time and was decomposing. He said that the last person with white blood died more than 200 years ago, but he was deceived because now a girl with such blood stands in front of him. He smiled and realized that in this world, there is no one more fortunate than him because he got a real jackpot. He slowly extended his vile dead hand towards this girl and wanted to touch her. She looked at him and heard him constantly say that he wanted to take her for himself and invited her to go with him, but she continued to look at him in fear and did not say anything. He grabbed this girl and put her on his shoulder, and after that he went to the dove of these fields. He walked slowly, and the girl felt the wind blowing her hair and how she was shaking, lying on his shoulder. She didn't understand what would happen next, but she knew that most likely this would be her end because her husband decided to leave her. She remembered a ghost, and they said that her white hair scared everyone away. She felt like an outcast and thought that she would always have to live among these terrible people who did not accept her. Children constantly offended her and said that she was disgusting because she looked at them and said that if she looked someone in the eyes, this child would die. Chow was very poor and constantly hungry. She walked around with a teddy bear and asked people to give her something to eat. But people behaved very cruelly towards her and simply poured their waste on her and asked her to never come near them again. The man looked at her as if some stinking bag of garbage was standing in front of her and asked her how she even dared to approach him and said that she was bringing bad luck to their village. But the girl didn't know what she was answering because she wasn't to blame for anything, and she just wanted to eat. But everyone blamed her for something she didn't do. Her every day was terrible because people constantly insulted her and called her an outcast. They wanted to drive her out of the village. When winter came, she couldn't even hide in the house because she didn't have a home. She had to sit near the fence and freeze. She didn't even have boots to warm her feet and sat barefoot on the cold floor. But suddenly a shadow appeared on her face and a man stopped in front of her. She looked at this man with her blue eyes, but she did not have the energy or strength to say anything to him. Young Mr. Beck looked at her in surprise and said that this baby is very cold and she will die if she continues to sit here. He brought her to his estate and gave her new clothes because her clothes were torn and wet. He gave her a warm blanket to keep her warm and allowed her to stay overnight. But next to her in the room there was a man who was dissatisfied with the fact that she was brought in, and he threw a pillow at her and said that he didn't want you to approach her evilly and only allowed her to sit near the toilet. She did all the dirty work that the other maids dumped on her, and they constantly shouted at her and forced her to do more and more work. The men also forced her to carry large boxes, and one of the movers said that if he worked hard for a given time, he wouldn't see food today, and she said that she could handle it. Chow understood that in order not to be kicked out of the house, she needed to work harder. She didn't understand why they were all angry at her because she didn't look like them. She heard women's laughter and women's voices and turned her head to the side to see what was happening there. She saw 3 girls in the window who were laughing and talking to each other about the wedding and how one of the girls was proposed to. Chow spied on them, and behind the fence I saw one of the girls show her wedding ring. She was very interested in watching them and thought that this was a very beautiful ring. But the guy who forced her to work saw that she was resting and spying on other people and ordered her to immediately return to work. When night came, she went outside and sat on top of the fence. She thought about family, marriage, love, and looked at the sky and thought that you are a star. This is her husband, and she heard what those girls were talking about. She was still very small, and didn't understand everything we weren't talking about, but those were very beautiful words. She was the silhouette of this man, and thought that the stars and the moon should answer her, whether she could get married, and whether he would be the only one who would protect her and scold others for scolding her or beating her. She wanted to know if she would have that person who would love her and do everything for her, and he would only be hers. She dreamed of meeting such a man to be her husband. After that, she returned back to the house and sat down, probably on the veranda, and began waving her legs, whining about why she doesn't have her husband. But one day, a young gentleman came to her and said that she should marry the owner of the mountain. Chow looked at him with a surprised look and couldn't believe that this was all actually true. She returned to her obligations and started washing clothes. But suddenly her cheeks turned red and she began to feel embarrassed. She still couldn't believe that she would have her own husband and would soon be sent to him. She constantly thought that she was very interested in what, but even if he didn't have a cool look, she didn't demand some angel to be her husband. She began to smile and be happy to see that now she will not be alone and she will have a husband who can protect her. At that moment, her aunt approached her and said that she was being married to a tiger, but Chow doesn't understand what I mean by this girl. But it continued to say that it is unknown when the tiger will decide to eat this little girl, his bride. But Chow just continued to look at her and listen because she still didn't understand what this girl was talking about. It all seemed strange to her. But over time, she began to realize that she used to be homeless and wandered the streets, and then they took her into a house. They dressed her in clean clothes and gave her a big room, and all this was done for one thing only. This was all done because she could not become a human, and these people did not want to accept her into their society. She realized that she was an ordinary ghost in human form. The black spirit stopped and hit the ground with his sword. He looked at her with his bloodthirsty gaze and took out a knife. He said that her blood and her body would belong to him. He said that he wouldn't leave this girl because he left her because he was a weak tiger. He said that she should not be sad because of all this, and should simply be reborn again, after which he took her head and began to slowly raise the knife up. He swung his knife and wanted to cut her neck and rip her throat. Chow at that moment remembered how the tiger walked away from her deep into the forest and left her alone with this monster. She remembered his cat face and said that she hated him and hated meeting him. She hates those moments when they slept together and hates being friends with him. Body with her small hands and said that she hated his warm hugs. She remembered how he defended her from those vile people who beat her and said that he did all this for her sake. She didn't even hate the gift that was the first gift of her life, and most likely the last gift. It was his gift. The knife was almost near her neck, and after a second, her life would have ended once and for all. She closed her eyes and accepted the fact that her life was over, and she would never meet her tiger husband again. But for some reason, she didn't feel pain. She only heard some strange loud sound, and when she opened her eyes, she saw splashes of blood flying in different directions in front of her face. Her husband, a tiger, appeared in front and bit off the hand of this black spirit with his large fangs. The black spirit got angry. She screamed very loudly in pain. He said that he would now kill this cat once and for all. The tiger continued to hold the hand of this black spirit in his hands. She looked at him and couldn't believe that he still returned the price and didn't leave her to die with this monster. Suddenly, a woman's hand appeared in the void and approached the girl. Chow saw the ghost of this girl in front of her and didn't understand what was happening. The ghost said that she was next to her and no one would hurt her. Chow got scared when she saw this girl and asked her who she was and what was going on here. The girl replied that her name was Hwarang, and she was a ghost that never left Sangun. But Chow didn't understand why I didn't come back. After all, her husband doesn't hate her. But Hwarang replied that it was a ghost, a very strong tiger, put her with this monster because it was a strategic move, because it was dangerous to fight him just like that. Hwarang told the girl that the tiger values her very much, but Chow said that when they last saw each other, he definitely said that he hates her. Hwarang hugged the girl and asked her to look at the tiger so that the girl could see how he was trying to protect her. The tiger fought a brutal fight despite the fact that he was several times stronger than him, and this battle could have ended in the death of the tiger. Chow only now began to understand what was happening here, and she became afraid for the tiger's life. She remembered her dreams that one day she would have the only husband who would protect her and scolds others for scolding Chow or beating her. She started crying and said that the one who loves her will do everything for her, and this person will be her real husband. Chow continued to cry and scream that she didn't know all this, and from now on she would obey him. Hwarang looked at the girl and realized that at that moment, the little girl realized a lot. She came closer to her and picked up a black cloth to cover her, and then said that it was very dangerous here, they needed to leave here. But Chow did not want to leave without her husband. Huarong looked at the battle and said that the tiger cannot fight normally at full strength because Chao is here now and the baby could get hurt, so he is not using his full potential. She looked again at the battle between the tiger and this vile black spirit and realized that Huarong was most likely right and she needed to leave here. When they left this cave, the tiger immediately thought that he could fight at full strength. He opened his mouth and a bright blue sphere appeared in his mouth with which he usually attacks the enemy. Tigers opened his mouth even wider and used the blue sphere to attack the enemy, and there was a very strong explosion and a bright flash of light. The black spirit flew back and felt incredibly strong pain that he had never felt before. But the tiger continued to attack him and used his big paw to crush the body of this vile spirit. He got into a frenzy during the battle and began to tear his flesh with the help of his large bones, and the blood flew out in splashes in all directions. But I paid attention to my opponent and realized that something was wrong here. The tiger continued to strike with his large paws and tried to tear apart the body of the enemy. But in front of him there was smoke, and the tongue of which he did not see where his enemy was now. Suddenly this spirit appeared in the darkness, but he was hard to see, and only his vile laughter could be heard. Tima opened his vile mouth and his two sharp teeth were visible, and he said that the tiger began to fight much stronger, but nevertheless, she remains just a pitiful animal. The black spirit turned into a big roof with nasty giant teeth and sharp claws. He said that he would tear out all the limbs and make a tiger and pull out all his insides. The tiger looked carefully at his opponent and realized that these were just rats without hair, and his blood turned into poison. He looked at the disgusting face of this big rat and understood that this bloodthirsty creature was ready to kill anyone and he needed to behave carelessly. The blood that fell on the floor turned into a living organism that could sit and function. Why was he surprised when he saw that this blood began to move and turn into some objects? He had never seen anything like this before. The black spirit began to laugh and create small roofs from this blood and said that the tiger simply did not take into account his real strength. The tiger saw that he was being attacked from different sides by small rats created from the blood of this vile spirit and understood that now the battle would be very difficult. The little bloody rats began to attack him from different directions and tried to stab him with their bloody sharp teeth and claws. The tiger was not afraid of these vile creatures and began to fight them off with the help of his large paw with sharp claws. After he destroyed several of these vile rats, he looked at his paw and the blood from which they were created began to turn into smoke. But the vile rat continued to laugh disgustingly and said that all these methods of defense were useless against his creatures. The tiger saw that his methods of destroying these vile bloody rats were useless because they were reborn from the blood and attacked him again. But the tiger continued to fight off these creatures because he simply had no other choice. He noticed that there were bloody marks on the paws and other faces after he destroyed these rats, and this alarmed him. After a few seconds, the blood that remained on him turned into these vile rats, and he did not have time to fight them off. The tiger felt that there were more and more opponents, and he was no longer able to fight them off, and they were absorbing his body from the back. But he didn't give up and continued to fight, and at some point, he thought that he didn't know how to continue to fight them off because his body was gradually beginning to paralyze this blood. He thought that if Huarong were next to him now, it would be much easier for him to fight with them. And at that moment, the roofs bit him on the back paw. He felt a very strong pain in his leg and made a dissatisfied face. The sneaky rat decided to take advantage of this moment because he felt weakness in his greenhouse. The big nasty rat used his leg to attack the tiger with all his might and knock him back. After the rat threw the tiger into the wall that was in front, he immediately sent all his bloody mice to attack again. He ordered his bloody roofs to attack him from all sides and kill him slowly and painfully. Tiger used his red vision, but even that didn't help him get out of this rat trap. After that, he started screaming very loudly and again used the blue sphere in his mouth, and all the crooked roofs scattered in different directions. He was wounded and very tired after using this spell, and he had very little strength left, but he knew that he needed to hold out a little longer. The rat stood in front of him and radiated its strong energy. He still had a lot of strength to fight, and he said that the tiger surprised him and fought very bravely. But the tiger didn't answer him. He just stood in front of him, bleeding. It seemed that a little more he would fall from powerlessness. The big rat decided to take advantage of this moment and put out his kochi to deliver the final blow and kill this tiger forever. But the tiger looked up at him and said that this dirty rat talks a lot, but talking won't help her. Huarong appeared behind this big, bald creature and swung her sharp sword to destroy this vile creature once and for all. She cut off the neck of this big rat with one precise blow, and the monster felt incredibly strong pain and began to scream loudly. Hwarang looked at this monster and told him that he was very reckless in thinking that it was so easy to deal with a tiger. But the bald roof no longer heard anything because she was writhing in pain and screaming in convulsions. The tiger looked at his opponent for the last time and told him that he wanted to personally see him die. The rat put his hand behind his neck and shouted very loudly that these chalk creatures had deceived him and dared to touch his body. The tiger said that they would not have a second chance to fight and raised his paw with sharp claws up and began to emit strong energy, after which he performed an attack called a furious fist. He made a rapid dash forward in the air and accumulated a lot of power in his blow in order to kill the enemy. The tiger strike was already almost near the enemy's face, and the rat saw its death with its own eyes. His eyes were ready to burst at any second from the pain and the bright light that was right in front of them. The tiger touched the body of this monster with his paw, and after the blow, his vile body was distinguished into a bunch of small pieces. When the tiger jumped back, he saw that half of this monster's body was no longer there. After a few more seconds, the remaining body simply fell to the floor. He began to emit from himself a blue flame that he had instead of blood, and this fire began to burn his flesh. His huge sword remained stuck in the ground, and his body was sunbathing in the background. When they left this vile cave, it was already evening. The tiger slowly moved its paws and said that he almost died in this cave, and every blow could have been his last. But when they left the cave, they didn't understand why it was still so light outside. Hwarang took the sword of this monster and 2 eyes that were in the cave. She said that they were able to get very interesting things, and in the future they will be very useful to them. The tiger looked at her and asked where Chow was now, and Hwarang said that she took her to the old man and told her to go to Huazhong village. He looked at her with a dissatisfied look and sighed, after which he stood thoughtfully for several seconds. Hwarang also looked at him and said that if suddenly the tiger dies, then she will lose all her strength. If this happens, then all these creatures will attack her. The tiger didn't like the fact that this ghost was using him for his own purposes, but he had no other choice. Hwarang said that they could go to her now, but the tiger seemed to have other plans and did not immediately answer her. The tiger lowered his head down and thought that as soon as he left his mountain beck, such terrible events immediately happened, and this would happen again. He thought that with such power, he was not sure that he could protect her again. But after that, he looked at Artifact and thought that after he killed this monster, he received eyes with the ability to transform, and most likely this was not an accident. He thought that if he were reincarnated as a human, he would be able to use this sword and be able to fight stronger opponents and be able to use a technique that he had not been able to master for so long, and this technique is called the flame flower. He looked ahead and thought that there was something he had to deal with as soon as possible. But first he had to turn into a man. Chow walked along a long path with her grandfather and his student towards the settlement. Grandfather turned his head and told the children that the village was behind the mountain that was now in front of them, and when they came to this village, they would wait for the tiger there. The boy turned to Chow and told her that the tiger could not be her husband, because this does not happen in the human world. But Chow got angry when she heard this and said that he didn't understand anything and grabbed him by the hair. After that, she forced him to admit that the tiger was her real husband. She moved away from him and said that if he said something like that again, next time she would hurt him even more, and the boy replied that he understood everything the first time. But suddenly a man in a hat appeared behind them and asked them to stop. This man in the hat looked at the old man and said that he didn't expect to see Chan here. Dosan from Gongryun, and the old man also recognized this man and called him by his name Sa-hin. The old man folded his 2 hands to bring this man and said that he expresses respect to him because he is a senior student, and Sa-hin replied that it's not worth all this formality. He smiled at his hat and said that he had already passed the 10th year since he left Gongryun. The old man smiled and said that people from there remain family forever. The senior student said that they are heading in the direction where the historian is, so I can't go to the village together. Instead of action, it is transferred to Mount Udun. A big wild boar shows his sharp crooked teeth and shouts very loudly to his leader that he must make a decision because there are a lot of people. Another boar shouted loudly that all the animals in this area were becoming common prey for humans. The great boar stood on the top of the mountain looking at his subjects, who were shouting at him and saying that if there was no great driving, then no one would care about them. The great boar looked at his subjects and thought that he really wanted to leave this place in peace, but there was no one who could protect these helpless ones. He thought that it would be too selfish to abandon them. At that moment, an eagle suddenly flew to him and ours whispered in his ear some information that only the leader heard. After he heard the information from the eagle, he stepped on his eyebrows and thought about something and ordered everyone to step aside. Suddenly, a tiger appeared in front of him and stepped very loudly on the ground with his massive paw. The tiger and the boar stood opposite each other, and there was tension between them because no one understood why the tiger came here. Back Mountain said that they had not seen each other for a very long time and finally met again after 30 years. The boar looked at the tiger and said that he hardly came here to see the past and asked what happened to him because he doesn't come to visit. The tiger asked the leader why he decided to try nostalgia. I try it temporarily because the tiger always came to find the flower of flame. The boar looked at the tiger with a dissatisfied look and thought that the flower that he wanted to get was a medicinal herb that was of great value, and the boar said that he had this flower. The tiger was surprised that the boar admitted that he had this flower. The boar said that he can give this flower to the tiger, but the tiger must do him a favor. But if you are refused, then he cannot even take a small stone from this mountain. The tiger looked carefully at the leader and asked what specific service the leader wanted to ask for. The boar looked at the tiger again and said that if the tiger is the one who defeated the bloodthirsty rat, then it will not be difficult for him to fulfill the following request. The tiger asked the boar to come closer to the matter and explain what exactly his request was. The leader smiled and said that this request was absolutely simple. In order to fulfill it, the tiger just needed to follow the leader's son and help him. He climbed onto the topmost stone and looked down. A large herd of wild boars ran very quickly heading down the mountain. The main boar stood at the top, watching as the rest of Kabanov's herd slowly descended down the mountain serpentine. The tiger moved forward along with these boars and tried to follow them. Hwarang looked at the tiger and told him that there were a lot of these boars and they could deceive the tiger. The tiger looked at her and replied that nothing can be done about it, and he cannot fight alone with all these boars. But the most important thing is that he will receive a flower. The tiger said that at the moment, he wants to follow this herd and see what is happening there, and as a last resort, if he realizes that they cannot cope, he will simply run away from here. The boar stepped on the ground with its hoof and drew attention to itself. The boar reported that they had arrived at the appointed place, and there would be a signal soon, so everyone should wait for this signal. The tiger approached the leader's son and said that he wanted to finally find out what was happening here. The boar looked to find and told him that there was nothing to worry about because the tiger would fight along with the boars, and the most important thing that they needed to know was that everyone who was here would risk their lives. Suddenly an eagle appeared in the sky and flew very quickly towards them. The boar said that a caravan with people appeared on the ramp, and these were exactly the people they were waiting for. The tiger saw that a caravan with people was driving in front of them and could not believe that they wanted to attack these people. The tiger felt the very strong energy that these people emitted and realized that they were Taoists. The tiger asked the boars if they really wanted to rob the things that are guarded by the Taoists and immediately by the cabbage rolls, who do not understand what they are doing. The boar got angry and once again repeated to the tiger that they know very well that today they will put their lives on the line in this battle. The boar said that their main goal is to increase the ball, and the Taoists carry this ball in their carts, and they must intercept it. The tiger was surprised when he found out that these boars wanted to get an increase in the ball, because he never could have thought about it. The enlargement ball is a potion with which you can increase the territory, and this is what many people dream about. The tiger was stunned when he heard their plan and said that the boars had gone completely crazy, and they were not able to take possession of such a fact. The tiger said that he will not take part in this, and will just leave here because he does not want to take part in this. But the boar said that the tiger made a deal with them. The boar said that it was too late to remove their hands, and they must finish this. At that moment, the leader climbed to the top from the peg. Then he could see everything that was happening below. He looked into the distance and thought that everything had already begun, and there was no turning back. He opened his mouth and said that it depends on whether their race will be able to cope with the consequences without taking into account the fact that they will take the ball and increase it or not. He understood that people were unlikely to sit idly by after a herd of wild boars did such a terrible act, and these little people would trample not only over this, but also over all their territories. He lowered his head down and realized that their clan would have been defeated and disappeared once and for all, but this would have been the case if the tiger had not come. The boars have already begun the battle and opened their large mouths to attack their opponents. They ran forward and picked up speed in order to demolish their opponents. All the wild boars shouted as one that they dedicate this battle to the tiger and the owner of Mount Back. People were shocked when they saw such a large number of boars approaching them and did not understand what to do, even though there was nowhere to go. At that moment, the tiger crept up from behind and wanted to attack unexpectedly, but one of the people noticed him. The tiger heard how people started shouting at him and said that this tiger is their leader, and he is the leader of all boars, and did not want to kill the tigers in the first place. But these words made him angry, and he realized that he would not allow some vile people to touch him, much less inflict wounds on him. So he immediately became angry and activated his red vision. The boar shouted very loudly that all these people would now be aimed at destroying the games, and he needed to try to evade the attacks for as long as possible. The warriors bravely defended themselves and the caravan that did not accompany. Having fought off several boars, one of the warriors stopped and decided to take a breath in order to understand where the next opponents were. He climbed onto the bodies of the dead boars and saw that reinforcements were approaching them, and realized that these opponents had no end. Hwarang said that this old thief set them up when he sent them on this mission, and asked the tiger what he would do, and explained that he has the option of returning to Mount Bayek. But the tiger replied that these people are boars, and this is exactly what they are trying to achieve, and he will not give them what they want. The tiger slowly began to walk forward towards his enemies, and said that this time their opponents are Taoists and they need to be careful with them. She threw a black cloth over her shoulders and said that she would be careful, and asked him not to worry about her. The man raised his glass of rice wine and saw a vibration in the water. He said that he couldn't calm down and was constantly worried about it. He stood up from the table and said that he was going alone and asked the old man to stay with his students. The old man sat at the table and watched the children quickly eat the food that was on the table and looked at the guy with his eyes. He went outside and began to examine everything that was happening here, trying to understand how serious their problems were. At that moment, one of the roomers ran up to him and told his master that he could rest and I couldn't handle everything. But when the gentleman looked at the battle, he realized that real chaos was happening here, and he couldn't stand idly by. So he immediately asked what was happening here. After that, he took out a large bell from his sleeve and realized that there was no other choice. He raised his hand up holding the bell and began to ring it. He used this bell to ring very quickly and loudly, and the sound carried over a long distance. The tiger had already heard the sound of this bell before, and understood that this was a very powerful weapon that was capable of destroying a large number of enemies at once. He looked wary and didn't expect to see such a strong enemy here. Their leader stood in front of him and looked very dangerous, especially when he held this powerful weapon in his hand. He looked forward and was surprised when he saw this animal in front of him and did not expect to see such a large animal here. The tiger was confused because he didn't understand how to react to these words and how to react to their leader. The man smiled and said that this tiger would make a very good skin, and then raised some kind of seal with 2 fingers. He put the seal on his palm, read the spell, and after that, the seal activated and sharp spears began to fly out of it. The tiger dodged these large wooden spears because he understood that if one of them hit his body, he could die immediately. He smiled at the man and said that he didn't expect that this kitten could come back from such a blow. The tiger looked at the wooden stick and thought that if he had hit it with this weapon, his life would have already been over. The tiger moved slowly and carefully and thought that, without exaggeration, this man has powerful spiritual strength and also has a strong blow. He looked at the man again and saw him take out a large number of seals from his sleeve. His eyes began to glow red, and he said that now he wants to test the strength of this little kitten and see if he can dodge so many blows. The man activated the seal with the 1000th hit power spell. The tiger understood that he now had serious problems, and he must quickly come up with something to evade these attacks. But the enemy's blows were very strong and large. It was difficult for him to dodge them because there were a lot of them. The man began to laugh loudly and shouted to the tiger to run as fast as possible, because if he becomes a second, his life will come to an end. But the tiger acted intuitively. He ran wherever I saw his eyes and trusted his inner intuitions, so he managed to evade all the enemy's blows. The man got angry when he saw that none of his blows hit this tiger, and said that this nosy cat was starting to irritate him. He started screaming very loudly and activated his golden bell, after which he shouted that he absolutely doesn't care about our skin of this tiger and he just wants to kill him. Suddenly, large wooden copies began to appear from the ground, and their sharp blades pointed at the tiger. He understood that these wooden spears were beginning to squeeze him into a large cage from which he was unlikely to be able to get out. His sharp thorns are approaching his body closer and closer, and he had no way to get out of here. And he realized that at that moment the end would come to him. But still he had one trump card up his sleeve, and this trump card was called the Furious Claw Technique. With the help of this military technique, he was able to break the wooden bars and get out of this trap, but the explosion that he created with the help of his energy attracted the attention of all opponents. The soldiers stopped the battle for a moment to see what had just happened next to them. The boars also moved back a little to watch the explosion that occurred not far from them. When the smoke after the explosion was blowing in different directions, they saw a large tiger with red eyes, sharp wooden spikes sticking out of its back. The man was shocked when he saw this, and he did not understand how this tiger could survive after his strongest attack. He looked at this animal and did not understand how it could have such great strength and cope with its attack. The tiger at that moment was thinking that he really didn't want to use this technique, but he had no other choice because if he didn't use it, he would simply die. Hwarang approached him and the tiger asked her if she could find what he asked for, and she said that she had already found it. Hwarang asked him what happened to him and how badly he was hurt because he looks terrible. The tiger did not hide his health and build himself up. The hero said that he was dying. Hwarang looked at him and realized that his strength was now running out, and he was now at the very bottom. The tiger said that they got what they wanted and now they just need to leave here, and Hwarang began to cover him with an invisible cloak. The man noticed that the tiger was slowly starting to disappear and realized that he had the power of invisibility. A few seconds later, this tiger disappeared, and the man did not understand where he had disappeared and how to find him now. One of the subjects suddenly ran up to the teacher and reported that they had serious problems. The gentleman asked the student what happened, and he answered him that someone stole the ball from the cart, and now they don't know how to find this object. After this news, the man began to bleed from his mouth and nose, and he did not understand what to do next. The student asked the teacher what was happening to him, but the teacher replied that there was no need to worry about him because he had just suddenly become weak. At that moment, he was thinking that if he actually lost the ball, he would be expelled from the community once and for all. He remembered that woman who was near Who's and thought that she used the power of invisibility, and thanks to her, they could not steal this ball. He looked at his servant and shouted loudly that they must immediately find the thieves to find the person who took this ball. But the servant replied that there were only 3 of them left and they could not cope alone. He started screaming very loudly and calling him cabbage rolls. He said that they saw how weak this tiger was and could finish him off. He ordered to immediately catch this tiger to death and then kill him. Chia was spying on these people from the carriage and suddenly realized that they were now talking about her husband, but she did not understand what happened here. It was late evening in the mountains and there was a lot of fog. The tiger walked with the ghost through the flower field. He said that most likely there is a big panic on the battlefield now, and he is interested in seeing his facial expression and it makes him feel good. Hwarang started yelling at him and said that now there is no time to laugh and he should think about himself because he is seriously injured. She thought that he was getting worse and worse, but he was trying not to show it, and she was wondering what happened to him. Suddenly the tiger fell to the ground and could not continue to move forward because the wounds were very serious. His strength was gone. He was lying on the ground and blood was flowing out of his mouth. He was screaming in pain and could not go further. The tiger said that this cannot continue and he needs to pull out these copies and backs. Hwarang replied that she will try to help him now, but he must endure the pain that he will now experience and show courage. When he felt that she was pulling a spear from his back, he felt incredibly strong pain, and his eyes turned red, and the blood vessels in his eyeball began to burst. His scream could be heard throughout the area because it was very loud. When she pulled out a piece of wood from his back, she was shocked because it was an unusual copy. She said that these pieces of wood began to take root inside his body, and because of this, he felt incredible pain in his body. Tiger, that this person is much more cunning than it seems at first glance, and his technique is very dangerous, but still she must continue to pull these copies out of his body. She replied that he was bleeding heavily, and she could not continue this matter. But the tiger said that if they don't do this now, then these branches have sucked all the blood out of him, and this is better than slowly dying painfully. Hwarang replied that this is not the best solution, and it is better to come up with some other plan while there is time. But the tiger insisted on his own and convinced her that he was strong and could withstand this pain. Hwarang understood that she couldn't waste her priest's time and therefore agreed with him. She walked up to his body and grabbed with her hand another branch that was sticking out from his back. She stung her lips and bit them with her teeth because it also hurt her to watch him suffer. In the mountains, you can hear the cry of a tiger in pain. 2 people stopped near this flower meadow, and one of them said that he had finally found the track of the tigers, and judging by his tracks, he was seriously injured. But the second person looked yes or said that you still need to be very careful because this tiger is not as simple as it might seem. But he convinced his partner that he knew what the strength of this tiger was, and I would explain that despite his severe injuries, these tigers are still able to survive. He said that next to this tiger there is a ghost, and the power of this ghost is priceless. If they take this power away from her and return the ball, they will receive a promotion. At this moment, Hwarang continued to pull out the large and sharp logs of that tiger's body and threw them on the floor. The tiger lost a lot of blood and experienced incredibly severe pain while she was pulling these sharp copies out of his body. Hwarang said that she pulled out all the branches, but the tiger still fainted and he lost a lot of blood. But he needs to be woken up because it's dangerous to be here. She turned her head back and heard the voice of people approaching them. She saw two people standing behind her, one of these people, and said that the tiger was breathing very heavily and this was his last breath. She didn't understand how these people were able to find her, but nevertheless she knew that she would have to resist and pulled out her weapon from her green medallion. The guys started laughing and asking her if she would really protect her master alone and if she was so stupid that she believed she could cope with this. They immediately made rapid leaps forward in order to attack her as quickly as possible. At this moment, their master was sitting on the floor and radiating blue energy from his body. He meditated and worked to restore his strength to the 3rd level. During the battle, he lost all his energy. He said that they were attacked by unusual, not bandits, but by some animals that attacked them, committed mountains. And at that moment, the guard saw some creature fly out of the gentleman's carriage with incredible speed, and he did not have time to see anything except a bright flash. The gentleman was flying at that moment, and thinking that despite the fact that he had not yet fully recovered his strength, he still had to find that ghost girl in order to pick up the stone on her neck. He smiled and thought that she would be of great benefit if he managed to praise her, and it was precisely for this reason that he did not want to waste time and moved as quickly as possible and jumped stone to stone in order to catch this girl. He thought that a strong tiger is a ghost, whose meanness this stone will soon die from his sword. He smiled his nasty smile and promised himself that he would catch them, and after that he would be the richest man. At that moment the tiger was lying in a flower meadow, and the man was rapidly flying towards him. He was approaching him faster and faster, and realized that this was the perfect moment. He looked at him, and thought that there couldn't be a better moment to kill him, because this tiger was lying right in front of his face. The boy told his teacher and grandfather there that Chow had disappeared. The grandfather asked the boy where she went, and he replied that she said that she was going behind the bushes to the toilet, but after that she disappeared somewhere and most likely went to the mountains. Chow understood that she could no longer be there and had to go in search of her husband, the tiger, who was somewhere nearby. She didn't know where exactly he was, so she trusted her intuition and went where her feet took her. She was sure that that person was talking specifically about her husband, and she doesn't know why they liked them, but her husband most likely came to pick her up. She smiled and said that now she would go to him and finally meet him because she missed him very much. The tiger at that moment was lying on the ground and bleeding. His eyes were closed and he was unconscious. The man came as close to him as possible and looked at this animal as an easy prey that now lay in front of him. He looked at the tiger and thought that most likely he died when he pulled out its branches from his back, and it was obvious. But he didn't like it because it was a boring death. He turned his gaze to the side and thought that if you, then the ghost, also disappeared, and the time had come to find the very thing for which he came here. But he came here from different angles. He didn't find the thing he came here for, and didn't understand where it had gone. But suddenly he realized that this little brat he had sent to find the tigers had most likely stolen the very stone we needed. The man got so angry that he got up, cut the tiger's body into 2 halves, and cut off its head. The tiger's head separated from the body and flew several meters forward. He couldn't believe that some brat dared to take away something that belonged to him, which made him even angrier. He understood that this lousy idiot could not run far and therefore immediately went after him. The tiger's head lay in the flowers, separated from the body. A chow appeared next to this head and came to this flower meadow. She slowly approached him. It was a terrible sight. She extended her small hand forward towards him in order to touch this head. Chow lifted his head with her small hands and saw blood flowing out of this head. She couldn't believe that her husband was killed in the same way. She stood in the center of a flower field and held the head of her husband's tiger in her hands. A few meters from her was his body, which stained the entire flower meadow with its blood. Chow looked at him with her blue eyes and couldn't believe that this all really happened. Suddenly a slight smile appeared on her face, and the corners of her lips turned up. She raised his head up and said that her husband was making jokes about her again like last time. Chow doesn't understand what happened and therefore decided to take his head closer to his body. She thought that he just decided to joke with her and thought that she would be scared. But this time she said that she would not let herself be deceived so easily and decided to attach his head to his body. She sat down next to him and began to stroke him and said that he could stop joking at the bottom and get up quickly. But when she removed her hand from his fingers and her head began to move on its own, suddenly she saw his head reconnect from his body and roll a couple of meters forward. Chow was not ready for such a sight, and the realization began to dawn on her that he was not joking with her after all, and he had really died. But she still didn't want to believe it, and it seemed to her that this was some kind of stupid joke that she didn't like. She bit her lip again and thought about trying again. Chow walked up to his body and grabbed him by the ears with both hands and ordered him to quickly stop joking with her. She reattached his head to his body and said that the tiger tried very hard for her, and now she must help him get up. But the head did not want to obey her and again fell off the body and rolled several meters forward. Chow stood in a field with flowers and watched all this. She said nothing, and at that moment small leaves began to fall from the sky. Tears began to appear in her eyes because she only now realized that this was not a joke, and in fact her husband had died. When she realized this, she began to scream and cry very loudly because the only creature that loved her and protected her now lies dead in front of her. All this time she sat next to his dead body and sobbed. A storm of small petals and purple lanterns began to appear around her. The evening was approaching night, but it did not get up from this place and continued to sit next to his dead body. Night fell and a big bright moon lit the way. The tiger's paws dragged along the ground and left claw marks behind them. Hwarang, with her thin feminine hands, carried a large carcass of a tiger and said that it was incredibly heavy. She touched her palm to his muzzle, emitting purple energy. At some point her hand got very tired and she could no longer hold it. She dropped the tiger to the ground and felt ashamed because she could not hold him. Suddenly, the tiger opened his eyes and his pupils immediately constricted. He immediately stood up on his paws and asked her when he lost consciousness and passed out, but Hwarang said that she was very glad that he finally woke up. Hwarang in front of him, I didn't understand what was happening here and how they were even able to get here, but then he saw how she was emitting a large amount of purple energy. He became scared. He said in a frightened voice that she looked terrible, and he didn't understand what happened, because she had lost a lot of her ghostly energy. Hwarang smiled when she saw that he woke up, but she herself felt terrible at night, and her energy disappeared from her body. One of the fighters decided to strike from the side with his sword. The second fighter also attacked her with his weapon, but tried to lunge the blow. But all this was pointless because it very easily repelled the blow, and after that began to counterattack with most of its attacks. These guys didn't understand how a ghost could usually have such incredible power, because if this continued, they would die right here and lose. But she was not going to stop and continue to attack them, protecting the tiger's body and herself. At this moment, one of the fighters pulled out 2 kunai from his sleeve and wanted to make a sneaky blow. He jumped up and used his kunai to kill the tiger, who was lying unconscious at that moment. The kunai were already approaching his face. Every second they could nail his skull. But Hwarang didn't let those kunai kill him and protected him with her back and took the whole blow on herself. The guy smiled and said that in order to save her owner, she is ready to sacrifice herself. But this is all because she has no other choice, and his life is the only way to exist for her. She felt very strong pain in her body and told them that she had been playing with them for too long, and now it was time to end this stupid battle. She looked at the tiger and told him that now it would hurt a little, but he would have to be patient. After a few seconds, she turned into a dark one that emits a large amount of black energy. The guy raised his head up and looked at this energy. He didn't understand what was happening here now. The second warrior made nature swing his sword over his head in order to strike and shouted that now she was creating illusions to distract them and would not be able to deceive him. The second guy put his hand forward and asked his friend to wait and not attack her so quickly because it could all be a deception. Hwarang at that moment activated her glowing eye and emitted great energy. At that moment, the guy who wanted to hit her with his weapon turned into torn pieces of flesh, and the hand of the second guy was also cut into several pieces. He saw how his fingers flew in different directions and were separated from his body, and he could not believe his eyes. He grabbed his hand and started screaming very loudly in pain because the feeling was terrible. He looked at his severed hand and held it with his second hand, but suddenly, a woman's leg came up to him. Hwarang stood opposite him and said that despite the fact that she had met all her strength, she would still never lose to scammers who have no idea of anything. He looked at her and tears began to appear in his eyes, because he understood that this woman was invincible and would die. He started screaming very loudly and asking her to notify her, and say that he was just following his master's orders. But she no longer cared about his words and simply used her power to destroy him. She looked at him with contempt and said that it was so stupid if he were in his place now. Asked for mercy after everything he did and said, but that's all he could do at this moment. He was introduced to a wild fight or said that I would never do that again. If she left him alive, he would do whatever she wanted. Suddenly she asked if he had a talent for magic, and he realized that this was his chance to survive. He raised his head up and said that he has such talent that he will do whatever she asks. She looked down on him and said that this is very good news because if he carries out her order and leaves her alive. She showed him the spell and said that he should look at it and immediately get down to business, and she would give him the necessary raw materials that would help perform this spell. She warned him that the thing he would do with this spell, he would have to eat himself and therefore should be very careful. The tiger asked Hwarang if she really gave him this item to eat and create a copy of it on this field. The tiger said that today she suffered a lot because of him, and he feels guilty for his actions. Hwarang extended her right hand to him and said that when he lost consciousness, she gave him that ball, and apparently it was really effective if he survived with such severe wounds. The tiger thought about her words at that moment, and he was just wondering if this item was really so strong. She hung her green medallion on his fur and said that all he had to do was drink everything and you would have beneficial effects. She said that this was the last thing she could help him with and told him that she would have a lot of fun participating in all of this. But the tiger said that she just needed to rest a little and recuperate. But she spoke to him as if she was saying goodbye, since she always. Hwarang touched his nose with her palm and her hand gradually began to disappear. She took his face with her feminine hands and said that she was afraid to leave him alone. Her body gradually disappeared, and before she completely disappeared, she told him that while she was gone, she wanted to ask him for something. She whispered her request in his ear, and then disappeared along with the flow of wind. The tiger was very sad after she disappeared and asked her to come back as soon as possible and said that he would wait for her. The tiger slowly went about his business and walked along the mountain grass and climbed up. Chow, at that moment, was sitting next to his clone, and all this time she thought that he actually died and cried near his corpse. The leader was very angry because his subjects, the boars, brought him the news that the tiger had escaped the battlefield and stolen an important artifact that they were hunting for. His loyal subjects stood and watched their leader's reaction. His eyes began to glow with rage, and he thought that despite this chaos, he took and ran away with the ball, and the leader realized that he did not underestimate this tiger, and as soon as he regained his strength and healed his wounds, he would immediately come for the head of the leader of the boars. He got even more angry and started screaming with rage. He ordered his servants to look for this tiger as quickly as possible because they cannot allow the victims that he will make in the future. He said that this tiger could not run far, and offend you need to find him and kill him before it's too late, because if they don't do this, then in the future, you will kill them all. At that moment, he was on the top of the rock. Watching what was happening below, he saw only fog. On his neck hung a green pendant that Hwarang gave him. He returned to the pond, which was located in the thicket of the forest, and green fireflies were flying in this place. He stopped near the water and began to wait for the appearance of the golden fish that always comes out to meet him. He waited for her for a long time, but she still did not appear, and he personally decided to call her by the name Manhwa. After he called her name, a yellow bright light appeared that slowly rose up. A golden head of a fish appeared from the water and asked the tiger what he was doing here, but this time, her head was a real mess. The tiger looked very painful, wounded, and dripping blood at that moment. She asked him what happened to him, and he replied that he didn't have time to explain and would tell everything later, but now they needed to leave here. She didn't understand what happened. She said that if the tiger came here to take her away, she would obey his order. She looked to the side and saw someone she definitely didn't want to see here and asked why the bastard Dancha would also go with them. And some kind of large root appeared on the ground that suddenly crawled out of the ground. It was a big child in the shape of ginseng roots, and he immediately started screaming that they wanted to leave without him, and it was better not to take such heartless people with them. The fish and the root began to boil among themselves and quarrel because they did not want to go together with each other. The tiger understood that he had no time for conflicts and ordered to leave here immediately. He asked to move quietly and not make unnecessary sounds so they might notice. The panther raised its big paw and pulled out its claws to stretch after a long sleep. She yawned very widely with her mouth and showed with all her appearance that she slept well. Suddenly he heard something in his ear and it immediately rose up. Her eyes began to glow bright yellow, and he immediately stood up on his paws and said that the owner of the mountain was returning here. She began to run forward and said that he knew this smell and would not confuse it with anything. The panther ran forward very quickly and laughed because this impudent person had finally shown up. She was already imagining in her head how she would tear him into small pieces and destroy him once and for all. But suddenly she stopped and froze in place, as if her body was immobilized. The tiger saw a panther in front of him and did not understand what she was doing here and why she just wanted to attack him. The panther was shocked when he saw the appearance of the tiger. He couldn't believe his eyes because you looked terrible. She immediately began to hiss like a wild cat and asked him who dared to touch him and what creature did this to him. He asked her in an indifferent voice, "What difference does it make to what you did to him?" Her eyes at that moment turned into the eyes of a little kitten who did not understand what to do and how to behave in this situation. She scratched her head with her claws and said that because of him now, she couldn't fight a tiger in a fair fight, and it infuriated her. But the tiger said that all he needed now was to fight a panther. He looked at her with a dissatisfied look, would say that he is a little busy if she wants to fight with him, then she can come later, and then he will play with her. But she asked him in a surprised voice when it would be possible to come to him later, because she had been waiting for this and meeting for so long. He looked at her and said that she was very stupid if she waited so long to meet him. He said that if she is so eager for battle, then very soon those with whom she can measure her strength and fight to the death will come here. And he doesn't even know who exactly will come here, Taoist people or stupid pigs. The girl who was there at the time was surprised when the tiger began to talk about his opponents. She said that she couldn't believe her eyes because the tiger was able to survive after the battle with the Taoists, and few succeed. Tiger, that he doesn't have time for stupid chatter and he has a lot to do now, so let the panther have fun alone now. The panther didn't want to just let him go and ordered him to stop immediately, but the girl who was standing next to her hit her very hard in the face with her fist. She turned to the tiger and said that if he listened to her now, she could help him, and said that he now has a lot of wounds and is left all alone. But the tiger looked at her indifferently and asked why she cared about his wound and his condition. The girl asked if she wanted to fly and team up with her owner, but for the animals this proposal sounded incomprehensible because they could not imagine that they would one day work together. The girl said that her owner dreams of making peace with the tiger on her own, but this will happen after the tiger heals its wounds. The tiger at that moment thought that there were no guarantees that he would get to the place of his cover before they found him, and their proposal suited him. The girl looked at him again and asked how he liked this proposal and what his answer would be. The tiger replied that this is a very good offer, but nevertheless he must refuse it because he cannot trust his life to such an ally. The tiger said that he did not want to continue his journey for fear that someone might bite him in the ass from behind, and the panther got angry when he heard these words and said that she did not behave like that. But the girl was not going to give up and pulled out some green object from her sleeve and then asked if this thing was familiar to him. She was holding in her hand a wooden tablet called a magic table. The panther asked her what it was because it looked very interesting, but the girl asked her mistress to shut up. The tiger thought that the sign that directly connected the life of the person whose name was written there was familiar to him, but he asked her what she was going to do with it. The girl bit her finger with her teeth and bit her finger until it bled. After that, she began to write something with her finger in blood on this tablet and said that she would write her name and the name of her owner here. After that, they both began to glow red, and the panther did not understand what was happening to her. After she wrote these two names on the sign, she approached the tiger and said that she was ready to give this sign to him. The tiger couldn't believe that this girl so simply wrote her own name on the sign and thought that apparently she was crazy. The girl asked the tiger why he was thinking for so long. She said that he himself should understand that if he has this sign, they will not be able to harm him. The tiger looked at her with an incredulous look and said that the fact that she wrote their names in it means that she is putting their life in his hands, and where did she get such courage from because they don't know what he can do with the sign. Suddenly the panther approached the girl and said that the tiger was not such a vile coward as to do something with the sign on which they were written, and the girl agreed with her. The tiger realized at that moment that they were absolutely not afraid of him and were completely confident in his kindness towards them. He thought about it because it was a very interesting step on their part, and he did not expect such a turn of events. But despite this gesture of trust, he still left the sign and said that he did not need it and began to leave. He said that such a thing would only be exchanged for him. But the panther didn't understand why the tiger was doing this to them because they were offering him their help. But he just silently began to walk away towards his cave and didn't tell them anything. He suddenly recovered, turned his head towards them and asked them why they were standing because they had a hard journey ahead of them. At that moment, the panther began to smile. She was incredibly happy that the tiger agreed to take them with him. She looked at the girl and showed her all her joy, and the girl was also happy that her owner would be next to the tiger. The panther came closer to the tiger and said that if he is now not able to cope alone, then she will serve as a support for him. The tiger did not understand what she meant, and the panther explained that there was a fascinating reed field nearby, so the tiger explained that they had come here. They decided to stop and rest because the tiger was very tired and needed to regain some strength. He lay with his eyes open and could not sleep. He was constantly thinking about something. He watched the girl who was constantly near the panther and noticed that they walked for several days without rest and was absolutely not tired during this time. He looked at her face and realized that her level was much higher than he expected. He decided to talk to her and called her Hong Yong, and she immediately responded to his call. The tiger asked her if she could teach him to hide his spiritual power. Hong replied that it was not difficult for her to teach him all this, but she wanted to know what she would get in return. The tiger looked at her and asked what she would like to receive from him in exchange for this knowledge. Hong replied that she didn't even know what to ask, but said that she noticed that the tiger guessed a lot about her and it was difficult to lure her with anything. She said that she was very different from her mistress, who slept peacefully like a small child. The tiger realized at that moment that she had chosen her master and had been accompanying him all her life, and it was unclear why she had chosen this stupid panther for everyone. Suddenly the girl asked the tiger about the ball that he carries with him, and he thought that if she wanted to ask him it would be dishonest. He looked at her and didn't understand how she knew about this ball because she couldn't know what was inside it. Hong at that moment began to laugh and clap her hands. She said that all this time she sat and guessed if he had this ball or not, and now she was absolutely sure of it. She said that she had lived a very long life. She had a highly developed sense of smell for such things. He felt embarrassed because of all this and thought that he was very sorry to give up this ball just for such a request. At that moment, it pulled out some kind of book from its sleeve and said that if he gives this ball to her in return, he will receive a sacred book. She said that this book is very ancient and powerful forces are hidden in it, and she lived understanding. But if he can master it, he can easily raise his level to Shinsu. The tiger was surprised at that moment because he couldn't believe that she had such a book, and they needed to think carefully about this proposal. He didn't understand where she got such a valuable book with incredible knowledge. He knew that people like him only have 6 levels of power, and all magical creatures like him dream of Shinsu's level, because he will turn into an incredibly powerful creature. Everyone knows that no matter how much a creature like him tries to raise his level, it is still impossible to do this above what is required, and it is very difficult to raise him by at least 1 level. But if suddenly he manages to get this book, then he will be able to become many times stronger even without raising his level. She held your book in her hands and said that it showed traces of the previous owner, and he was clearly not at the highest level. The tiger said that the previous owner most likely simply could not fully master the knowledge that is inside this book. He looked at her again and asked if she was happy with this exchange and said that she was losing a lot. Give this book to him. But the girl replied that everything was fine and she wasn't worried about it. But in addition, I would like to ask him to be more friendly with her owner. The tiger asked her if she just wanted them to be more friendly with the owner and replied that if this was all her request, then he agreed. Suddenly she heard something out of the corner of her ear and immediately became alert. The tiger also heard some strange noise not far from them and raised his ear up. I didn't hear the stupas in the distance and realized that the pigs were already approaching them. She looked at the tiger and said that if they agreed on everything and discussed everything, then the tiger could calmly go forward without them. The tiger asked the girl if she could cope with these boars and if she needed any help. She replied that the tiger probably has big plans since he is on his way to the place he speaks of, and said that she trusts him with her owner. The tiger looked at her and said that he understood everything. He was surprised that she was so worried about her owner, the panther. The tiger began to wake up the panther with the help of his paw, telling her to wake up quickly, Vitya. They don't have much time. The panther woke up unhappy and said that he didn't understand why he had to wake her up because he had such a wonderful dream. The tiger said that he would not discuss her dreams with her now, and they needed to get out of here as quickly as possible, and ordered the priest to get up immediately. The panther asked Hong Young why she was standing still, but the girl replied that she would soon catch up with them and now they should go forward together. The tiger said that he would not wait for her long and asked her to hurry up, and after that the panther quickly began to run after him. The girl followed with her gaze and watched as they both moved away, and it all disappeared into the distance. After that, she turned her gaze to the side and saw that the enemies were already approaching her. Behind her, there were a large number of pigs that were coming out of the forest, and they were all very angry. The whole way the tiger talked about how she couldn't believe that he had received such a valuable book with which he could increase his level. But the panther asked him why he gave her this strange ball, and the tiger explained that she would have to give this ball to Hong Young in exchange for books. But the panther didn't understand at all what happened between them and why they exchanged these objects. But the tiger said that she was already starting to irritate him, and at some point they came to the same tree that grew in the middle of the field. The panther looked around and asked if they had come there and what kind of strange places they were. The tiger touched the tree trunk with his paw and said that she should look carefully. After he touched the tree, some kind of white glow began to appear in this tree. The branches on this tree were dry. There were no leaves on them. It seemed that this tree had dried up a long time ago. But suddenly yellow leaves appeared on this tree, and no one could believe that one day this tree would bloom again. The panther was shocked when he saw such a beautiful tree. He said that it was magic. After a few seconds, something began to happen to the ground, and the panther ran back so that the ground would not give way under its feet. Suddenly she saw that a tunnel appeared below the ground and steps that led down. The tiger said that he accidentally discovered this place, and if she enters here, she will be able to fully use the power of the ball, and no one will interfere with her. And the panther only now realized what was happening, and said that she did not want to waste any more time and was ready to go down. The tiger began to take the first steps and go down, and he moved very carefully. He asked her to keep up with him. He thought that from the moment he raised his level, no one would dare to encroach on his life and be his competitor. He thought that no one else would suffer because of him, and he would never hurt his loved ones. The tiger continued to go down the steps, and with each step he plunged deeper and deeper into darkness. The girl was able to catch up with them, and the next morning stood near a tree on the branches of which there were no leaves. She looked at this tree for a long time and thought about something. Behind her there were wild boars who constantly shouted at her and asked how long they would wait, because 3 whole days had already passed, and they were tired of waiting. She turned her head at them and asked what they would do about the fact that he was tired of waiting. The boars began to get angry and ordered her to immediately tell how this place was opened, and they themselves would go inside. But suddenly the ground began to shake. The boars began to get even more angry. At some point, explosions occurred in the tree trunk and the earth began to fly in different directions. There was continuous smoke around them after the explosion and dust that rose into the air. The silhouette of a man emerged from the fog and his face was not visible, but his outline was clearly visible. She turned her head back and was surprised when she saw a man there. She couldn't believe that I didn't come back so quickly. The boar shouted very loudly that it was a tiger, and he clearly felt its vile smell, and he was sure that it was the same tiger. But in front of them stood a man in black clothes with orange stripes, and he didn't look like a tiger at all. This man looked at them and called these pigs stupid. He looked at them with his red eyes and said that if they still didn't understand anything, they understood that there was the same tiger they were hunting. The boars could not believe their eyes because the same tiger stood in front of him in the form of a man, and they did not understand how he turned into a human form. Sangun, the owner of the mountain, was a very tall guy with long black hair tied in a ponytail and red eyes. He stood opposite them and looked at them with his human eyes, but there was something bestial in his gaze. Something remained in him from the tiger that he was before. A second later, he made a jerk to the side and disappeared. It happened so quickly that the boars didn't even understand where he was, and after a split second, he struck the boar in the neck with his captured sword and drew blood from it. The boars were not prepared for the fact that their enemy would have such fast speed, and immediately decided to attack him from different sides and surround him so that he could not escape. Sangun looked down and thought that this was all very surprising, and his physical abilities improved after he turned into a human. He began to pull the sword out of the body of the dead boar, and the blood scattered in large splashes in different directions. This weapon begins to absorb blood from the body of a dead enemy and fills with energy. When he completely pulled the sword blade out of the boar's body, he saw that his weapon began to glow red. One of the boars shouted very loudly that this weapon is called the Sword of Justice, and it is capable of sucking the blood of its victim. He looked at his weapon and asked the sword how he tasted blood, and the sword began to emit very strong energy. He thought that this weapon looked very scary, but it had its advantages. The boars surrounded him on all sides but were afraid to attack him. They did not understand what to do because their opponent had just increased his level. The main boar got angry and shouted very loudly that they should not be afraid of this weakling because he is now alone, and in a crowd they will easily destroy him, and reminded them that before they defeated the enemy much stronger than him. The boars looked at their leader and tried to overcome their fear because his speech was motivating, and they remembered how strong they are when they fight together. One of the boars shouted loudly that I will not be able to defeat my opponent if they attack him with all herds. At this moment, the animals took off and began to pick up speed in order to crash into their enemy with all their might and tear him into pieces. Sangun was watching them all this time, and when they started running towards him, he said that it was all very obvious, and he predicted their attack. But the most important thing is that he was waiting for this attack. He raised his sword high up the mountain and emitted a large amount of bloody energy from his weapon. The sharp blade of his sword quickly flew down, and it seemed that she was about to split the earth into two halves after touching it. He carried his weapon into the ground, and after that, a very strong storm of violet energy began to appear around him, which surrounded him from different sides. The boars stopped because they did not understand what kind of black-purple fog was now in front of them, and they became scared because they had never seen anything like this before. But their leader shouted very loudly that now there was no time to be afraid, and they should forget about their fear and continue to attack him. The black fog became larger and larger and began to envelop this entire space. But the voices of boars were heard who did not want to give up. But at some point, there was so much fog that they stopped seeing each other, and one of the boars began to cough loudly and said that he could not see anyone and did not understand where his brothers were. He was not going to give up despite the fact that he did not understand where all his brothers were and asked them to follow his voice. He loudly asked them whether they could hear him or not, but what he heard in response was terrible, and he began to feel his powerlessness. He heard the voices of his brothers who were screaming and asking for help, not begging not to kill them, and asking someone to pull them out of this darkness. He was left alone in this darkness, but continued to slowly walk forward despite his fear. But suddenly he felt terrible pain and became incredibly scared. He had never experienced such sensations before. When the smoke around him began to disappear, he felt that all the hair on his body had disappeared and blood was flowing out of his ears and eyes, and all he managed to say were words of mercy. But it was all pointless, because at that moment black hands with red eyes began to touch his body. These hands with their sharp claws began to tear him into small pieces. Another boar at that moment saw that his brother was being taken into the darkness and these vile hands and tried to run after him in order to save him. But when he approached him, it was already too late, because his brother the boar had disappeared somewhere, and around him there were only red, terrible eyes that looked at him from different sides. He screamed very loudly and cursed Sangun for what he did to him and all his brothers. But these were his last words, because the last words he died from being torn apart by sharp claws. Sangun at that moment just stood and watched his enemies die one by one. And I couldn't do anything about it, and looked at his new weapon, with which he was able to achieve such great results. After some time, the black smoke cleared and it became light outside again. Sangun looked at his weapon and realized that he was so hungry and wanted blood that he didn't leave anyone alive. If he hadn't been distracted for a second, he would also have become a victim of this weapon. He picked up the sword and wondered where the great weapon came from. He even thought that it might make sense to throw away this toy. She approached him very quietly and said that it was a very impressive battle and did not expect that he was capable of such things. Sangun hid the weapon in the green medallion and answered her that he himself did not expect this, but no less he coped with this weapon. She smiled and congratulated him on increasing his power level. She said that this is always a very important moment in life. But she was still interested in one question. She wanted to know how he managed to turn into a person. But he replied that this was a very long conversation and he just couldn't tell her about it. She asked him if this was all connected with his new bride. But he didn't want to answer anything and just pressed his lips to think a little. After that, he waved his head in different directions and answered her that it had absolutely nothing to do with her, and he didn't understand why she even remembered about her. She didn't believe his words and only narrowed her eyes to look at him carefully. Sanggong said that he was going to Mount Wudong and asked her if she wanted to join him, but she closed her eyes and exhaled. After that, she said that her mistress moves as slowly as a turtle and Veet is always late, so without her she cannot answer this question. She took out a golden snake from the sleeve of her shirt and said that as soon as the mistress wakes up, she will definitely look for Sanggong and asked him to take this item. Sangun scratched his face with his finger and then asked her if it was a love bracelet, and said that these bracelets are usually worn by couples in love. But she replied that this was all nonsense, and he didn't have to worry about these stupid stories about this bracelet. And at that moment, the snake came to life and jumped towards the guy. He looked at his hand and saw how the landslide snake nods his hand and becomes his bracelet. She said that she would give the other half of this bracelet to her owner so that they could always find each other. But Sangun was clearly not happy about this. She looked at him and said that he probably wouldn't transform into a tiger for a long time, and asked him if he could lend her one thing for transformation. Sangun asked her if she was really talking about the transformation ball and said that she wouldn't need it. But she explained to him in an insistent voice that she really needed this ball. Without thinking twice, he took the ball out of his pocket and gave it to her, after which the girl thanked him. He looked at her, smiled, and said that he would not waste any more time because he already had to go, and he said that it was unknown when they would meet again, and therefore wished them to take care of themselves. She said goodbye to him and watched him go into the distance and turn into only a small, dark silhouette. She looked at him and said that she also didn't know when they would meet again, but it would definitely happen. She continued to stand near the dry tree and said that she was looking forward to their next meeting. Night began in the mountains and a white fog appeared that covered the mountains like a blanket. The guy raised his head and looked forward. He had a dissatisfied expression on his face and a tired look. This guy looked at the darkness that was in front of him and asked why life was so unfair to him and why he had to stress so much because of it. He turned his head back and looked at the old man who stood behind him the day before. He asked if this is where the same Sangun lives. The old man answered the guy that everything is exactly like this, and every resident of the village of Beck knows this place. He was still unhappy and said that there was no one in this cave, and the elder replied that most likely he guessed about their arrival and ran away. The guy touched his finger to the golden sphere and said that he thought that if he ran away, they would not be able to find him. But if they put his hair in this compass, he would not be able to escape. With the help of this compass, you can't find out where it is and find it anywhere. Although there is a disadvantage of this item because if you use a compass, then you can't use it for another 2 days. After they activated this compass, a red beam of light appeared, and the guy said that the compass shows the east-south direction, and the journey will take 3 whole days. The guy with red hair replied that in that case they need to hurry up, and they can't waste any more time, and he wants to get rid of this tiger as soon as possible. Red pointed his finger at the east-south side of the mountain and said that they were leaving for that area immediately, and the soldiers who stood behind him replied that you would carry out the order of your commander. The next morning it was very bright in the mountains, and the weather was quite warm. There was a bowl of green grass on the grass, and suddenly someone's voice shouted very loudly that she had no right to pull out the shamrock from its territory. But the voice of a little girl answered that she didn't know. The girl was very scared and said that her chickens were very hungry, and she decided to bring them food. But if they were hungry, they wouldn't lay eggs, and then everyone would starve. But his voice continued to shout at her and scolded her for the fact that she had no right to talk to him like that. He looked at her with his red eye and said that in the end they are raised to be devoured, and called these people vile. He started laughing very loudly and said that as long as Sangun is there, she won't be able to take anything from this territory because he is protecting this place. She thought that this rabbit could be bargained with and that he was not as scary as he might seem because of his rude voice. But the rabbit decided to show her all his anger, and again began to shout at her and said that she had no right to tell them anything. If she wanted to learn the sharpness of his claws in her own skin, then he could arrange that immediately. At that moment, the girl thought that Sangun was a big and scary tiger, but now a small rabbit was standing in front of her, and the rumors deceived her. The rabbit pulled out his sharp little fangs from his paws and tried to scare her. The girl was small, and such a rabbit could not frighten her. Just like a large predatory beast, she saw that the rabbit's kocha cut the air and asked not to kill her. He felt that his plan worked, and he succeeded in scaring this little girl. But suddenly someone grabbed him by the big ears and lifted him up, and after that the voice of the guy asked the rabbit why he was impersonating Sangun. But the rabbit did not know that the great tiger had turned into a man, and therefore continued to snarl and scare him with its claws. The girl said not to meet that this rabbit should not be touched, because it is the same Sangun who owns this mountain. The rabbit began to shout loudly that he is actually the owner of this mountain, and this is his territory, so no one has the right to communicate with him like that, and a pathetic person has no right to hold his ears. Sangun was surprised when he heard this rabbit's words, and said that he didn't expect to see Big Sangun in the form of a rabbit. After that, he used his power and showed his true appearance, which only a rabbit could see. At that moment, the little animal was so frightened that its eyes almost fell out of its skull, and the rabbit began to beg farewell. Sangun looked at the girl and told her that everything was fine, and she could take everything she had collected in the basket. He helped her pick up a bowl of green grass and said that Sangun is actually not as greedy as they say and will not be angry with people for just collecting grass here. The girl immediately thanked her savior and then ran away towards the village to feed her chickens as quickly as possible. The rabbit at that moment felt as awkward as possible and didn't even know how to get out of this situation. Sangun continued to hold his ears and spoke in a low voice that they needed to talk about the situation that had just happened. Sangun suddenly said that he hopes that this rabbit's ears are attached not only for decoration. If he does not answer the question, then he will have to cut off these ears, which are of no use. Sangun asked the rabbit who was in his cave during the time he was away here. The rabbit immediately began to talk about how 3 days ago some Taoist people came and were looking for something. Then they went in the east-south direction. Sangun his beard and said that 3 days ago that time he reached the village and it is located in the east and south direction, and they definitely followed him. He narrowed his eyes and thought that he wondered where he would go, and they would follow him. And he had to go to Mount Udon and cut everyone's throats there. But first, he wanted to find out the level of the Taoists and find out their number, because until this moment he cannot act rashly, and he must find out what their strength is. But suddenly an interesting idea came to mind, and he even smiled. He called the rabbit to him, and the rabbit immediately responded and asked how he could be useful. Sangun said that if the rabbit does this, the master will tell him now. Then in that case he will be released from here alive. When the king listened to his plan, he immediately ran to the rest of his friends like a rabbit and began to tell them this plan. After that, he ran to the deer and told him that the Taoists had caught the owner of the mountain. After that, he ran to the bear, who at that moment was eating honey, and the rabbit thus spread rumors throughout the village. The eagle fixed its gaze and carefully watched someone who was below. After that, he raised his sharp eyebrows and was clearly dissatisfied with something. He took a leap and flew into the air, flapping his wings. The eagle flew forward and accelerated its speed every second, and its wings looked like large sails. He flew to his friend the boar and reported that the Taoists had caught Sangun, and now they were coming here. The boars began to get angry and did not understand why these people had not yet killed this vile tiger, and now he decided to come here with them. The leader Kabanov replied that this vile tiger was not going to die alone, and therefore decided to come here with friends. The boar raised his head up and asked his leader what they were going to do now after learning about his plan. The leader replied that this tiger probably said that he hid Dobungwan's ball right here, and that's why they decided to come here. But the boars could not believe that this vile tiger had collected for them. They are now putting their lives at risk, and for their mistakes. With a laugh, Kabanova answered them that it would be best now to leave this place as quickly as possible and get out of here. He hit the stone with all his might with his mighty hoof and broke it, because this was the only way to show his strength. The boars bowed their heads down and realized that they must listen to the orders of their leader. But at that moment he became even more angry and looked like a real demon, because he was very unhappy that these stupid boars so easily agreed to leave their home and leave their homeland. He started shouting loudly and saying that the land here is ideal for them, and they know this area better than anyone else, and will be able to fight and defeat any enemy in the battle while being here. He started screaming very loudly and saying that they would slaughter all the people and get this ball for themselves, and after that he ordered all the boars to gather for the battle. In the forest at that moment it was quiet and calm, and there were no signs of trouble. But suddenly some very fast man flew by and jumped off the ground as if he were real lightning. He began to get angry and shout that I was a vile degenerate. He began to get angry because he had lost the trail, and he had a feeling that this tiger had grown wings for himself. Red asked his assistant where this tiger is now and what the compass shows, but his assistant replied that he is not moving and is standing in one place. He said that the compass is now pointing to Mount Udon, and most likely he is now located there. Red replied that in that case they couldn't waste time. They had to speed up and get there as quickly as possible. After what moment did they disappear, and only traces of dust remained? The soldiers offended their masters as quickly as they could, but they did not have the same speed as their masters. But they did not know that if they missed their trail, in this case they would be punished. At that moment, Sangun was standing on Mount Wudong and observing this area from a high. He said that he had already prepared everything for this day, and now all that was left was to wait until I didn't come here. He promised that he would return to this game everything that it had done for him. It was gradually starting to get light in the mountains, and it wasn't so dark anymore. The soldiers stopped for a moment to catch their breath and drink a little. Red stood at that moment and looked into the distance. He thought that they could hardly reach this mountain, but now the hardest part of this task remains, because you need to find this tiger here in this large territory. But then suddenly, He remembered that this tiger was severely injured by the Taoist, and if they separated, they would definitely find him. But suddenly, in the distance, they saw some guy who was walking alone in the forest and decided to call him. He stopped and looked at them in surprise and pretended as if he didn't expect that they could stop him. He asked if they were calling him and looked at her in surprise. Sangun sat down next to them and began to listen to everything they told him about. He sat on a stone and listened to a guy with black hair say that they were looking for a big tiger and he was eating people, so they came to catch him, and one of the soldiers said that until he killed someone else, they should not praise this tiger. Sangun looked at them in surprise and said that now everything became clear to him, and he doubted and did not believe his eyes when he first saw this tiger, but now he is sure that they are talking about the tiger he saw. They were delighted and immediately began asking him where he had seen this big tiger. He smiled because he understood that these people were on his hook and now they are in traps and he can manipulate them as he wants. Sangun said that it was difficult for him to explain the specific place where he saw this tiger and offered to guide them personally so that they would not get lost. After that, they went on a hike and Sangun led them into caves near the rock so that they would definitely not get lost and took everything under his control. Sangun said that even in a dense forest, animals pave the way, and poets often walk on the road with large and formidable animals. He turned his head back, looked at them, and said that if they follow it, they will come out to the place where he saw this big tiger. Sangun noticed that there were 2 Taoists and 6 minions among him. He smiled and said that even if they have a high level of strength, there are still more boars than these soldiers, and he can't wait to watch this battle. Sangun asked these people if they know anything about Mount Wudong. These people thought about it and said that they know very little about this mountain. Sangun replied that wherever they go, it is necessary if there is a story that has taken root in a certain area, and it is not for nothing that this mountain is called the Mountain of Dominance, because all creatures from people, even animals, who love to dominate everything, have gathered here. Sangun touched the tree trunk with his hand and said that they say that boars dominate this game now. The soldiers looked at him in surprise and waited for him to tell them more about this place. He tore off a piece of wool from a tree. Boars said that these animals leave their traces here in the form of wool. The red-haired guy started laughing and said that it was all very funny and that pigs dominated this area. But the assistant replied that he had heard that their allies had recently been attacked by these boars and suggested that the tiger could have deliberately lured them here into this trap. But the red-haired guy did not give these words much meaning and said that these are ordinary animals and they cannot pose a big threat to them. He asked him to listen to the weapon and doesn't say such nonsense because you can't even hear insects here, and he doesn't understand why they were so scared. But suddenly the soldiers began to look around and heard some strange sounds that alerted them. One of the soldiers looked to the side and noticed that some large creature was approaching them. They noticed that wild boars suddenly started running out of the bushes and screaming very loudly, and they immediately grabbed their weapons to defend themselves. The boar ran very quickly and swiftly towards them in order to throw them away with the help of its large fangs. The soldiers were not prepared for these wild boars to attack them so suddenly. Their commanders reassured them that this would not happen. But suddenly this boar crashed into a stone, and they thought that he was just running past them. One of the soldiers asked in surprise why the wild boar passed by the field and did not hit him at all. But the second soldier shouted that more wild boars appeared behind him, so you need to be careful. The guy didn't understand why he was screaming so loudly and what kind of boar he was talking about now, but at that moment a huge animal appeared behind him and was ready to trample him at any moment. A second later, his black cap flew into the air from his head. His body was pierced by the large, sharp tusks of this boar that attacked him from behind. The guy started screaming very loudly because he couldn't believe that they were attacked by such a big... But the boar was very angry at that moment and was already running towards its next victim. The red-haired guy stood at that moment and watched all this from the side. At some point, he activated the fire in his palm and began releasing his power. He said that it made him laugh that these animals were able to attack them from behind and use such cunning tactics. He said that if they decided to do this to him, then he would burn them to ashes. At this moment, the soldiers fought against these large animals and began to lose. The boar was much stronger than this man, and he understood that it was impossible to defeat him with one sword. But suddenly he saw a large flash of red light near him and felt that he was getting very hot. At that moment, the red-haired guy touched the body of this boar with his fiery hand and began to burn his body alive. The soldier began to thank his master Apyeong for saving his life and not allowing this boar to kill him. But Apyeong ordered this soldier to immediately get ready and take his weapon in his hands and continue to fight, because if he is distracted, he will be slammed. The rest of the boars were in the bushes at that moment and watched as this guy burned their brother alive. He looked at his other comrade who stood behind him and asked him if he was still alive. The boar replied that these people immediately began to use their abilities, but yours predicted that this could happen. The boar said that he would try to change his place, but suddenly a man appeared next to him who said that he would not allow him to do this and said that I should not all cut my throat. But when the boars already ran forward, they did not understand where the man had come from behind them and what he was doing there. But at that moment they looked forward and were afraid. What they saw was terrible. A man with one blow could cut a boar into two halves and destroy it as cruelly as people can kill. At this moment, the guy held his hand in front of him and used bubbles in the form of his weapon. He told his comrade that these boars were not as stupid as they thought of them, but if you believe in your eyes, we could not kill everyone who was here. The soldier shouted very loudly to his master that I didn't lose that guy who brought them here, and Kim Yong replied that apparently these bands took him with them, and he just needs to kill all these pigs. The boars were very scared and did not understand what to do with these people. At that moment, Sangun slowly and quietly crept up behind them, and he carried out his plan that he had come up with in advance. Suddenly, he began to shout very loudly and call his brother's people, and shouted that he had found the boars, and these words frightened the boars so much that they began to run forward in fear. They ran away so quickly that no one even understood what happened. They didn't even have time to look at the person who was there the day before. Sangun laughed very quietly because their reaction to his cry was priceless. He said that it is still very difficult for animals to suppress their instincts, and that is why they are not ordinary stupid pigs. He started to get angry and said that he would continue to mock them until they destroyed each other. The boar did not understand what these fools were doing and why they did not follow the plan that they had originally outlined. He began to get angry, and you could see the rage in his eyes. You could see veins appearing in his eyes like apples. The leader was very angry and said that he would sort everything out himself, and he could not hope to find the stupid boars. He called them non-entities who were not capable of anything. We saw that they just needed to follow their plan. He continued to run forward and pick up speed, and didn't understand why I didn't stop following his plan. He knew very well that boars are stupid creatures, but he didn't think that they were so stupid. When he came to the battlefield and saw how people, with the help of their magic, calmly fought against his boars and destroyed them, he didn't understand what was happening here at all, and everything he saw was terrible because there were only 10 cabanovos left. One of the soldiers shouted to his master that the largest boar had appeared in front of them. Kum Yong narrowed his eyes and looked closely at this big boar, and concluded that this boar was the head of all these same animals. The leader's assistant came up to him and asked if it was worth calling all the other boars here, and the leader said that finally this fool had started to act. Sangun was sitting on a stone and talking about what was expected. He would start to flutter when almost all of his subordinates folded their hooves, but even those who survived looked tired. After that, he said that cowards like the leader of the boars would never be able to defeat people like him. These words angered Kabanov even more. He ordered to immediately go on the attack and attack the enemy using all his power. The leader shouted that he would go into battle with them and not together defend the mountain that belongs to them. Red drew attention to the leader of the herd of boars and said that he had a very impressive size. So he used his fiery powers to make even more fire appear in his hand. He began to get angry and said that with his current attacks he would not be able to scratch this big boar. But if he revealed his full potential, then he could destroy him. He began to scream very loudly and emit a large amount of fire from himself. He wanted to put an end to this battle and become the winner. He used a spell called Phoenix, and thanks to this spell he created a large fiery phoenix which he threw at the leader of the boars. But the boar was absolutely not afraid of this guy and said that with such weak attacks he would not be able to kill him. The boar understood that this guy was underestimating him and therefore hit the ground with all his hoof. His eyes began to glow yellow, and he shouted that he would take the lives of the TV man in exchange for those boars from whom he took the life. I love Kabanov repelled the phoenix's attack and destroyed this angry creature with one blow. The red-haired guy did not understand what was happening. He was extremely surprised and scared when he saw the power of this beast. A few seconds later, he saw in front of his face this huge muzzle of a large boar who wanted to crush him once and for all. The boar was already practically near his body, and in a matter of seconds, this man could turn into a crushed pile of meat. Once the rest of the boars were not prepared for such a strong explosion to occur and began to close their eyes, and some boars even flew away from the blast wave. People also could hardly stand on their own feet, and the blast wave pushed them back. After the explosion, there was a lot of smoke and dust. No one saw what happened and who won this battle. The guy touched the stone that was on his hand with his fingers, and this stone created a shield. Red said that he was already preparing to accept his defeat and come to terms with the fact that he was about to die because he did not expect that this boar would have such great strength. But his assistant replied that it was very stupid to spend all his strength so thoughtlessly. Blood dripped in large drops onto the ground and created a bloody puddle. The boar closed his eyes, and there was a wound on his forehead from which blood was flowing. He said that he attacked with all his strength, but this man was able to parry his blow, and because of this, he lost half of his tusk. The boar began to slowly approach the people, and the other boars also gradually approached them. The leader thought that this battle would be much more difficult than he thought, and he did not understand what to do now. Taoists stood in front of a large boar and talked about the need to restore strength and finish what they had already started. But suddenly he appeared on the battlefield and said that it was not interesting to fight like that and would not ruin the whole show. Taoists don't understand why this guy appeared so unexpectedly that he's here. The leader of Kabanov also looked at this guy in surprise. He absolutely did not expect to see anyone else here. Sangun slowly approached him, stepping from foot to foot. But at some point she pushed herself off the ground and made a jump up, after which she disappeared. They didn't even have time to understand where he had disappeared, but Sangun had already landed and was behind them. Sangun grabbed the Taoist by the hand and said that interfering in someone else's fight is dishonest, and thus he is violating the main rules of confrontation. And this is called cheating. And for this, he will take away the stone that was in his hand. The guy didn't even have time to blink his eyes before the stone disappeared from his hand. He was furious after seeing that his protective stone had just disappeared. This guy allowed himself to take such a valuable thing. But Sangun just started to be happy and laugh because he took this interesting thing from his hand. The Taoist began to get angry and shout that this guy had become impudent and allowed himself to touch things that did not belong to him. The redhead shouted loudly that he wouldn't just leave it like that and the guy would pay for it. The boar carefully watched this guy and suddenly realized that this man was very similar to that same tiger Sangun. Sangun at that moment showed his true look and pulled out a sword from the green talisman, after which he said that the vile old man boar has an excellent sense of smell and Sangun should return the debt to him. At that moment, people started getting angry and screaming, took out their weapons and said that they would take revenge on this guy. At that moment, the boars began to shout in unison that this man is actually a tiger and this is the same Sangun. Sangun snapped his fingers and said that he was very glad that everyone finally knew that he had turned into a human. He snapped his fingers very loudly and then said that he was tired of playing these stupid games and now it was time to end it all. Suddenly the ground under their feet began to tremble and some strange magnetic waves appeared. The man looked down and did not understand what was happening to the earth and why it suddenly began to glow. But suddenly a person with great strength appeared in the air who emitted a large amount of blue fire. The Taoists did not understand what was happening here and simply tried to observe all this because they would not be able to escape from here. Demonic rats and various animals gradually crawled out of the blue fire. Red didn't understand where this man got such great power because what he just created is beyond the control of an ordinary warrior. The leader of the Kabanov said that this is Shinsu level power, and he does not understand where this stupid tiger was able to get such great power. Red suddenly realized that this level of power had disappeared from their world a long time ago, and he had only heard about this level of power in legends. He didn't understand how this kid could use such a high level of power. He looked at this guy and saw his red animal eyes that were inside the darkness, and he thought that he needed to tell everyone about the great power of this man. He said in a trembling voice that he needed to run away from here and try to get out and tell everyone he asked for this monster. But it was already too late because this guy was standing in front of them, and he was much taller than not everyone else. He walked past them, holding in his hand his demonic sword that emitted blue flames. When Sangun passed by them, they began to burn with blue fire, and the sword that touched him was able to take away their souls. After a few seconds, there was nothing left of them and turned into just a pile of ash. Sangun walked up to his infiltrated herd of boars and stopped right in front of him. The boar couldn't believe that this guy had such incredible strength. He closed his eyes and started laughing. He said that now everything became clear to him. I didn't just fall into the trap of this tiger. The leader looked at him again and said that the power that protects him from the tiger is actually incredible power, and he was finally able to raise his level of power. Sangun asked this boar if he wanted to say anything before he died. But the leader of Kabanov replied that he did not see any point in saying anything before he died. Sangun slowly began to raise his sword up to strike. He very quickly raised his weapon up and cut the boar's body into two halves. Sangun smiled and said that asking for anything before dying was stupid, especially after what he wanted to do to him. Sangong stood and watched as the body of this giant boar turned into ashes and scattered in the wind. Until the next day, the weather was beautiful and the sun illuminated the mountain valley with its rays. The scene moves to the village of Beck. The guy took out two necklaces and a green ball. He held them in his hands and told her that despite the fact that they were of a low level, he was still able to get these two necklaces and a ball. He took out a book and said that this was how he managed to get 3 useful spells and 2 useful books for learning. He started laughing and saying that he had a good catch. He thought about his sword and said that if he used the power that controls his weapon, he would devour absolutely everything. He began to hide new objects in Green Talisman and was upset that his weapons were so strong that it was impossible to use his powers to their fullest. He remembered that I received 2 letters that came to him recently. He looked at these letters and thought that there was probably something important in them, and he was confidently sure of this. A little girl came up to him and said that she didn't know and didn't understand what to do with this, and Sangun remembered this girl. He said that she was the same little one that he protected the rabbit. She smiled and replied that thanks to him, her chickens eat well and grow very large and lay large eggs, which she sells and buys reading lessons for the money. Changun thought that her reading skill was very useful, especially at that age, and the girl said that if he needed someone who could read, she could help him. She took the letters from him and said that she would now help him read what was written there. The girl opened this letter, smiled, and began to carefully examine everything that was written there. The letter said that their battle with magical animals does not end, becoming more and more, and the place of the Red Sea can turn into a battlefield against magical creatures. Sangong was shocked when he heard them talking about war. The girl didn't seem to understand why he reacted this way to all these words, and the guy told her that it didn't make any sense to her and asked her to read further. The girl continued to read that the government's actions are very alarming to these people, and the last thing she read was that all Taoists are asked to be careful and prepare for further events. She said that this is all she can read because she doesn't know the rest of the letters and words. Sangun patted the girl on the head and said that she did well and asked if there was anything she would like as a thank you, but she replied that she didn't need anything. She smiled and said that the young master saved me last time, so it was her duty to help her. But he saw something strange in her eyes and for some reason froze for a moment. He remembered that same girl who constantly stuck to him like a leech and called him her husband. He smiled slightly and it was noticeable how the corners of his lips slowly rose up. He understood that she didn't ask him for anything, but nevertheless he decided to give her a gift. He handed her a green bag with which they found some strange things. He said that this was his gift for her. She took this bag and looked at the iron things that were in it. She said that these things were very shiny and beautiful. He asked her not to show these things to anyone, to run home as quickly as possible to hide them, and be sure to open them with her mother. After that, he told her to leave already, and the girl thanked her brother for giving her such a gift. She waved her hand at him and said that if suddenly he needed to read something, he could always turn to her. Sangun smiled and thought that this girl was very sweet and kind, and he was very glad that he could help her. He raised his head up and froze for a moment as if it was becoming very difficult for him to breathe. He looked at the sky and at the large clouds that were floating across so it wasn't you, and said that he was not at all ready for the war to start. It was already dark in the mountains, and the fog again began to cover them like a blanket. He returned to his cave and said that the Red Sea is the region to the west of here, and if a war breaks out, it will quickly reach his village. He touched the stone rock with his hand and began to climb down with his hand. After his hand went down this rock, some hieroglyphs and inscriptions appeared. It was as if he activated the cave with his touch. After a few seconds, a large rock opened and rose up, as if a large gate, and the entrance to the cave opened in front of him. He saw large steps leading down into darkness and stood right next to these steps. He looked down and carefully examined what was there. Sangong took his first step down and said that if a big war breaks out between humans and magical creatures, then all the evil souls will cause chaos in this mortal world. He continued to descend from this cave, gradually disappearing into the darkness. He walked along a large long corridor all alone and thought that all people need only one thing in this world. After that, he went into a large gap between the walls, and in this gap there was a bright blue light. He walked towards this light and said that people only need strength, and for the sake of it they are ready to do anything. He walked through this portal and saw a large black bird in front of him, and said that this is the power of Shinsu, and absolutely everyone wants to get it. At this moment, it was very interesting to find out if anyone else knew about the fact that on Mount Beck, there is something that no one thought had disappeared many centuries ago. He continued to walk forward slowly and fog appeared around his leg. He said that before he couldn't even approach this place, he was repelled by this force. It is located right here. He was directly opposite this great beast and did not feel any problem. The energy of this beast began to turn into a whirlpool. The big bird began to scream very loudly and make incredibly loud sounds, but Sangun was not afraid of it. He was ready to swallow it whole. The bird began to scream even louder and made the most disgusting sounds that could ever be heard. The huge animals opened their mouths wide and began to spit out large rays of light from their mouths. Sangun was right in the center of this beam, and when it ended, he felt that his clothes were burned in some places. He thought about the fact that he had raised his strength level to almost the maximum, but still, he could barely withstand this damage, and he did not understand whether his body could withstand it. At that moment, the birds spread their wings wide and very quickly began to swing them in different directions. Sangun felt his body begin to collapse from different sides with this flame. At some point, he disappeared in that moment and only his silhouette was visible. The bird watched all of this and continued to add fire to this big hurricane. Her eyes suddenly became red and she decided to add even more fire to this initiation. Sangun felt incredibly strong pain and could not believe that his body had not yet been torn to pieces by such a large amount of Rona. He understood that I was obliged to withstand all these tests and stretched out his hand forward in order to get through this fire. He raised his hand to this big bird and shouted that if he doesn't get it, and right now he will never come into the light again and it's better to die here. He grabbed this big bird by its heart and said that from now on it will become his strength forever and no one else can have it. At this moment, the gigantic power of this huge bird began to obey him and penetrate his arm and body. He looked at his hand and saw this blue flame radiating from his fingers. Suddenly it was all over, and he felt the pain disappear somewhere. He couldn't believe that he managed to do this, and that he was able to absorb the power of this great beast. He decided to use his power and began to scream very loudly, and at that moment his powerful burst out. He felt that this was happening for a reason, and the animal that he had just absorbed continued to be marked while inside him. Sangun the rag clenched his fist and shouted that he would not let her win, and that this power of Shinsu belongs to him since ancient times. He used all the strength he had left to overcome her and remain a winner inside his body. He told her that if she wanted to win, she had to do it right now, and he would help her adapt to his body. His voice began to glow brightly with red flames, and his pupil constricted like that of a wild animal. He flew into the air, and his outer clothing was destroyed, and his hair flew up. He said that 4 years had passed, and during that time 1,000 changes had occurred inside his body. He landed on the ground and deteriorated from the pain he felt. Sangun said that he was able to achieve absolute perfection and he was finally able to control those blue flames. He looked at his hand and said that he was able to move from Yonghwa's level to Yomryuk's level. He's very fast and clenched his fist tightly and destroyed the fire that was in his palm. After that, his clothes returned to their original form and he stood in the middle of this large empty room. He crossed his arms and said that he had so much to do that he didn't even know where to start. But he remembered about the child who appeared in his life and decided to meet her first. Sangun began to slowly walk forward, and a large bird flew behind him, which he was able to tame. Now it was his totem animal. He came to the village, and by this time it was already evening, and the sun was setting below the horizon. Despite the fact that it was already evening, there were still a lot of people on the street, and they were all going about their business. Sangun walked up to the merchant and asked the girl who was standing behind the counter if she knew young Ah. The girl looked at this guy in surprise and asked if he was interested in the child and the Yong family. People who are looking for a case not far from him said that if he is looking for this child, then he was sent into slavery a long time ago, and this happened a very long time ago. The man said that they suddenly had a lot of money, and after that they didn't send their daughter to school in the yard. They couldn't come to terms with the fact that just people were studying with their children and began to attack them. The men said that in the end these people were stolen all their money, and this girl was left as a slave in Peichi's house, and now they want to make a concubine out of this girl. They started laughing and said that the last time he saw her, she had a straight pointed nose and pale skin, but no one knew that she would become so beautiful. They began to discuss the fact that this family was always into beautiful girls, but Sangun didn't want to listen to all this stupid talk and asked them where they were now. He got angry and asked them where Peichi's house is now. When night fell, he went to the place that these people told him about. The girl took the sponge with her fingers and dipped it in red paint. She applied blush to her cheek and decorated her face in this way. The servant at that moment was combing her hair and said that this is the house of the richest man in the village and she should know how many girls are jealous of her. But she was not happy about all this, and she looked very unhappy and sat in the middle of the room with a feeling of injustice. She looked down and thought that she had something that many girls dream of, but I absolutely didn't need it, and she wanted something completely different. At that moment, a huge moon appeared in the sky and illuminated this village like a large lantern. She left the house on the street and raised her head up to look at this moon. The light seemed to illuminate her like a large spotlight. She stood right in the center of this light. Suddenly, she heard the voice of some guy who stood behind her and asked her if it was her. He looked at her with his red eyes and said that she finally got it on the sofa after all this time. She turned her head back and in a surprised voice asked him if this was the same brother she had not seen for many years. He smiled and asked her if she still remembered him because they had not seen each other for a very long time. She said that she remembers him very well. After all, we hadn't seen each other 4 years ago, and he helped a lot then, and she said that he had not changed at all in all this time. He said that this time he had to teach her to write, but he felt that he had to do it. She was surprised when she found out that her brother came here to teach her to write because it was all very strange, and he was gone for 4 years. She smiled and was very embarrassed, but after that she said that she would definitely learn all this, but not enough time. They sat down near a large tree and he began to show her books that contained a lot of interesting things. She looked at these books and said that if he writes as indicated in this book, the meaning of the sentence will change. But suddenly she lowered her head down and began to feel sad. Her expression on her face was terrible, and she seemed to turn pale in an instant. Sangun didn't understand what happened and why she changed so dramatically and what happened to her. She closed the book and said that she wanted to finish this lesson at this point, and then sighed heavily. She stood up and said that she was very glad that he had mastered sumac today and called him well done because he had come a long way. After that, she took the money with both hands and said that she suddenly remembered how she was discriminated against for being a girl, but she did not give up and continued to study, probably thanks to her brother. She was brave. Sangun asked her what exactly she meant and why she decided to talk about courage. She answered him, taught him the letter, and now would like to ask him for one wish. The gentleman was trembling, and with great difficulty moving, he slowly walked towards his house. His legs were shaking, and one of his shoes flew off his foot and fell down, but he continued to walk forward. He held a bottle of alcohol in his left hand and touched the door with his hands to open them. When he opened the door and he saw in front of him a girl who was sitting and obediently waiting for him at home, he was very drunk and looked at her like a prey. He asked her how long she had been waiting for him and said that in order to cheer himself up, he drank a little. He approached her, didn't know which side to grab her from. He said that she looked even more beautiful in this dress than she was. He reached out to her with his vile hands and said that today he would not go to heaven, and she should calmly obey him. But at that moment, the dagger that was in her hand became and pulled it out of the case. He wanted to grab her breasts with his hands, but she hit him with a knife and cut his face. He saw the mark of a knife blade appear on his face and saw a splash of blood. She put the weapon forward and said that she did not want to live in such a house with such a terrible person, and she was ready to die and kill him instead of living such a terrible life. But her behavior made him very angry, and he hit her on the head with a bottle of alcohol, and the bottle broke on her head. She stopped for a moment and felt severe pain. Her head began to spin, and she did not understand what was happening. He was very angry and shouted and called her a stupid fool, and after all, he did not spare compliments for her. Instead, she decided to kill him with this knife. He said that now she would die, and no one would even remember about her because she was just an ordinary stupid fool, and once again hit her with his fist with all his might. But after he hit her, she just sat near the wall, didn't even make a single sound. She just closed her eyes. He began to get angry because this bastard didn't even make a single sound after he hit her and didn't even ask for forgiveness. He started laughing and said that she made him very angry, and even in this state she excites him, so he doesn't mind playing with her. But suddenly someone took his hand in the back of his shirt and began to pull him away from it. Sangun threw the man back and then asked the girl if this was exactly what she wanted. She just sat and breathed heavily but didn't answer him because she didn't know what to tell him. She simply looked forward, but there was emptiness in her eyes, as if she herself did not understand what she was asking for, and she herself did not understand why it was all needed. Sangun said that because she asked him to find silver and send him to hell from here, he began to worry about her, but she turned out to be even more unpredictable than he expected. At this moment, the young gentleman was angry and decided to take revenge on this guy for interfering in the conflict between him and his servant. The young master decided to ask this guy who he was. Where did he get so much courage to come here so calmly and start fighting? But Sangun simply turned his head towards him and looked with his demonic gaze at this underdeveloped idiot, so that he immediately understood that it was better not to play with him. Sangun turned his head and said that he doesn't have time for these stupid squabbles now. He remembered the same girl who called him her husband and said that she would not go anywhere without him. Sangun slowly walked forward towards his opponent in order to punish him once and for all. She, the young master, began to beg for mercy. Chow appeared before his eyes again, looking at him with her blue eyes. He looked up at this gentleman and understood that he had already driven one little girl out of the village once and would not allow him to destroy another girl. The young master didn't understand what was happening and you started screaming very loudly in fear. Sangun put his hand forward and touched his head with his claws, using his strength to. He said that there is that same Sangun whom this gentleman has been trying to kill all his life, but unfortunately, he will never succeed again after he used his power. A large blue whirlwind appeared in the city. It was still dark in the mountains, and the fog lay on these mountains like a big blanket. Sangun and this girl left the village and walked out towards the big mountains. She looked at him with admiration because he again saved her life and freed her in the paws of this monster. He just silently continued to walk forward, and she looked at his back. He was a real hero for her. But she still couldn't believe that her brother turned out to be the real Sangun, the one she had heard legends about all her life. He suddenly said that she heard a story that happened to her, and he asked her in a surprised voice if it was all because of the jewelry that he gave her. She didn't answer him, and just looked at him silently. There was surprise in his eyes, and she didn't understand how such a great owner of the mountain could communicate with her. She said that she could not hate the one who helped her, and instead she was very inspired by the fact that now she could finally fulfill all her dreams. But then she couldn't see how vile, cunning, and greedy people can be, and she was too trusting and naive. She started crying and said that she really wanted to do the things that she liked, but for some reason life did not allow her to do this. He continued to look at her. He felt sorry for how she was crying because she simply couldn't do anything due to lack of strength, and now she didn't understand where to go next. He hit the ground with his sword with all his strength, and the stones scattered in different directions after the sword collided with the ground. He ordered her to immediately pick up this sword and said that it would become dear to her and show her the way. At that moment, she even stopped crying and heard him offer her to become his follower and learn to use this sword, and in that case she would protect this mountain. But the girl replied that she was a woman and she had never held a weapon in her hands. But he objected to her and said that this is all a prejudiced attitude towards women, and that your confidence was enough when she began to study, and her courage when she wanted to live this life that she herself chose. He continued to look at her with his red eyes, and she saw that he actually believed in her as no one else had ever believed, and he called her strong. She was shocked when she heard from him and Cheslav, because no one had ever called her strong in her entire life, and she always thought that she was a weak woman. She pressed her lips for the first time. Men recognized her strength, and she understood that they believed her. She made her choice and extended her hand towards the ball to grab it by the handle. She raised the weapon with 2 hands and said that this sword is very heavy, and this is all very strange for her, but she will try anyway. She promised him that she would try to confidently follow the path that he offered her and be sure to cope with everything. She said that if he believes in her, then she promises him to protect this mountain until he comes back. He looked at her with pride and said that she had done well, and now she had made the right choice and should continue living. 3 months have passed since this day, and the scene of action is transferred to Mount Ilwan. Sangun stood in front of the large gate and thought that this castle was very large, and he did not expect that it would have such dimensions. He knew very well that all the people were saying that this place would be unusual. The castle would be very high, but now Mount Back seems so small to him compared to this place. These gates were built a long time ago. Because of them, there is the treasure of Sable, and so that they do not put the inner one, he doubles this. Many wish him. He stopped and raised his head up and said that although he had come here in the guise of a man, he nevertheless did not know under what pretext he should go inside. He scratched his cheek and said that he needed to think about what exactly to say before coming here. But suddenly an old man appeared in front of him, surrounded by several guys, and this old man asked him if he was a wanderer. Sangun replied that everything was exactly like that and asked the old man why he was so interested in this. The old man smiled and replied that this guy was exactly the one they were missing because they needed one more person, and said that he should go with them because there was no point in just standing here. The guys grabbed his hands and said that they should all go that way together, and he wouldn't lose anything if he went with them. In the sky at that moment there were white clouds floating across the sky. N opens once every 100 years. The guy said that this was a big event for them. If they were lucky and could go inside, it would be incredibly lucky. The second guy started laughing and said that if he stood in one place, he would look like an ordinary stone near the door, and if he just stood there, they would never open up in front of him. They said that he looks smart but doesn't really know anything. All these words began to irritate Sangun, but he tried not to show it. Suddenly, one of the guys said that they should enter through the emergency entrance, but not through the central one. Sangun thought that these fools don't even understand what will happen to him if they go into the interior, and even if they defeat weak enemies, then a real one awaits them. But Sangun didn't worry about this. The most important thing for him was that these doors opened. The old man pulled some kind of talisman from his sleeve and raised it up. He directed this talisman at the doors, and some kind of orange ray appeared that opened these doors. After some time, the doors finally opened, and a bright blue light appeared in front of them. There was a silhouette standing in these doors, and his face was not visible, but this man turned to Manhwa and told him that they were late. The old man explained that they were missing one more person, and while they weren't looking, they had to spend a little time. This guy stood with his back turned to them, and he waved his hand and then said that it doesn't matter and they should already go forward. When they arrived at the place, they saw a large altar with a lot of bright green fire, and someone shouted that each squad should remember its name. They were very surprised because they had never been here before, and for them it was all the first time, and they tried to look at everything as carefully as possible. Suddenly, some commander approached them and pointed his finger at these people. He said that I was not standing idle and should take their places as quickly as possible. Sangun watched them carefully, thinking that he now belongs to the 5th squad and should follow them. Suddenly, in response to the demand, a man appeared who shouted very loudly that today is 100 years since the doors of the mountain open and he welcomes everyone present here. The first squad of men who often had tattoos on their faces was called Ilvon. The second group of men with long beards and long hair was called Mudan. The third detachment with strong men in red robes was called Yomyeonjong. And the fourth detachment consisted of only girls, and this detachment was called Amy. The fifth detachment was distinguished by a certain style of clothing using hats. This detachment was called Pingun. And the last squad with elements of blue clothing was called Daesan. The man hit himself with his fist in his palm and shouted loudly that in this case they can start teleportation. There is no point in wasting time. At this moment, the gates began to open, and the teleport began its action, after which they all moved to another space. Sangun carefully watched all these feelings as his body gradually disappeared and was transported somewhere. The severed head of a large snake suddenly appeared in front of them, and some monster sat and tried the flesh of this animal. This monster cut off pieces of meat and chewed them with her teeth, enjoying every bite. His eyes glowed green, and he said in a joyful voice that his favorite rebels had finally arrived. Now he could have fun properly. He welcomed them with open arms and a joyful voice to all the newcomers here, and after that he began to laugh. They saw a bright flash of light around them and realized that their bodies were moving to some other space. Sangun stood with his eyes closed and tried to understand what just happened to him, because he did not expect that teleportation magic would be used in this place. The rest of the people looked around. We looked at everything around them. They tried to understand where they ended up. One of the guys shouted very loudly that there was something scary ahead and in a trembling voice tried to warn everyone. They saw a large wolf in front of them. It was a magical beast, but they were very scared when they saw such a huge animal in front of them. The warriors immediately began to grab their weapons. They did not understand why at the very beginning their enemy was such a large beast, and they did not understand how they would fight it. This wolf had a huge sharp horn on his forehead, and he bowed his head towards the people and ordered them to stop immediately. Suddenly a man appeared in front of them who ordered everyone to be silent and did not move. He said that all these fighters are stupid because they cannot distinguish sacred animals from beasts. The leader began to shout that because they were so stupid they would never be able to go higher to sleep, but this only made the other soldiers laugh once. A man with a long beard looked carefully at this beast and said that this big wolf is the guardian of Yongna Mountain. Another man came up to him and extended his hand. He said that this beast is actually the guardian of this mountain, and he protects the mountain, and he is so big because he has reached a high level in strength. But the man with a beard said that the person should say hello to him. The man with the tattoo on his face smiled and said that this is why this beast is what their clan is proud of. The animals stood on the top of the mountain, watched all these little people, and did not communicate with each other about the fact that they needed to focus on the main task and divide into groups. The wolf suddenly raised his ear up and heard some strange sound and immediately reacted to it. And he was like an animal that broke his chains and began to rapidly run forward. This large animal saw Sangun in the crowd of people and immediately ran towards him. He stood out to the entire crowd for the special energy that his body radiated. The big beast stopped behind him and looked at him with its big animal eyes, and Sangong felt this beast with his back. He opened his eyes wide and his pupils constricted. This usually happens when he senses danger. He said in a quiet voice that he was doing very badly, and apparently this beast revealed the truth and realized that he was not really a person. Sangong understood that if this sacred animal revealed to all the Taoists that he was actually not a man but a tiger, then all these people would attack him and fight him. But what a big beast there stopped for a moment and bowed his head. He smiled. Sangong was surprised because he did not understand why this sacred animal decided not to reveal his identity and still left him alive. A man came up to him from behind and touched his shoulder with his palm. Sangun reacted to this touch and turned his head to look at this man, after which the man said that they don't need to stand in one place rooted to the spot and they already need to move forward with the others. He pointed to a column of people who were already walking forward one after another and said that they were all leaving and we needed to catch up with them. People could be heard talking in the mountain, and one of the guys asked another if he had really been inside the mountain 100 years ago. The second guy replied that he remembers that he saw many medicinal herbs that he could not, and remembers it as clearly as yesterday. The girl suddenly stopped and said that if this is true, then they are not sharing herbs together, but no one knows whether this is the right way or not, and it seems to her that they are trampling under the same place. In front of them was an old man with gray hair who stopped after he heard their indignation. He turned his head back to look at them and began to laugh, and after that he asked the girls to trust him and said that for him, it was all only in favor. But one of the girls didn't like his smile and his stupid laugh, and she said that if he suddenly thinks of something bad, he won't be able to avoid his death. At that moment, there was a sudden splash of blood and no one understood what had just happened. The girls looked back in fear and a mask of horror froze on their faces after what they saw. In front of them stood a large bloody demon who was emitting terrible red energy, and this demon was holding one of their friends by the head and dragging the girl behind him, screaming and asking for help. The leader of this group of girls was shocked when she saw an evil spirit here, and she did not understand how he got here. But he demonstrated his dominance when he was next to them and was absolutely not afraid of these girls. He was already anticipating how he would eat their delicious bodies and licked his lips and his teeth with his tongue before. It was quiet and calm in the forest, and large clouds flew across the sky. But suddenly people appeared who moved very quickly through the air, jumping from one tree branch to another. The guy told the older student that all the other participants were left behind. The older student replied that he didn't care about it, and they didn't come here to study botany. He shouted very loudly that if all these people were left, they might be killed, but he was not interested in the lives of these people. He looked down and said that they were attacked by enemies and they needed to stop immediately. At that moment, other people from a parallel detachment were approaching them from behind. The man stopped and put his palm forward and created a ball with a white flower inside. After that, he immediately made a dash and began to run away somewhere, absolutely not paying attention to others. They became very interested in why the senior student was behaving so strangely and why he ran towards the horses that were nearby. The senior student's hand was stained with dirt because he had been touching the ground with his fingers for several minutes and digging a hole. Suddenly, he took out the skull of some strange animal from the ground and said that he had finally managed to find this object. The younger student said that he was surprised that the older student was looking for this particular item and asked him if the teacher had asked him to find exactly this. The senior student explained that this is a rare egg, and a golden lichen always grows under it, and it is very special, and the teacher used to say that it was not time yet and hid this egg back here, but now it is just perfect. The senior student felt triumph and began to come up with his cunning plan. He said that now I can't afford much, but at that moment who's ordered them to stop. People appeared behind them and said that they had studied something here and would not allow these guys to just pass by medicinal herbs. The senior student said that he does not understand what the Daison squad is doing here. But the leader of the squad, Tayson, smiled and said that it was now clear to him where their friends were running so quickly. But now it was clear to him that they were looking for such a valuable thing in these lands. The older student replied that they found this item first and it belongs to their squad, so they are not going to share. But the leader of the detachment, Tayson, called his warriors to him and said that he was absolutely not interested in a diplomatic solution to this problem. He would simply take this item by force. The senior student, in a loud, irritated voice, asked him what he wanted, and if he attacked now, a war would begin between their clans. But the leader of the squad, Tayson, just smiled and said that if two squads looked at the same thing, then they should measure their strength. But the older student was not happy that they wanted to start a fight now because this was not part of his plans. The leader of the squad, Daesan, hit his weapon with all his might and then shouted so that only the winner could take the prize for himself. Sangun at that moment was very worried about something, and his pupils were tense as if a real hunt was being conducted for him. But in fact, he pulled out the root of a medicinal plant from the ground and then shouted in a joyful voice that he was finally lucky. He held this root with his fingers and said that this paradise is already more than 150 years old, and this is a real treasure for him. After that, he took out a tool for digging roots from the ground and said that he probably has the talent to dig one without a single scratch on it. But suddenly he threw away the tool for digging weeds out of the ground and said that he didn't think at all. He strained his vision and said that it was very dangerous and he almost got a taste and forgot why he came here. And he didn't come here for that at all. He suddenly began to get angry and thought that he could destroy everything here. But suddenly his partner ordered to quickly catch up with them because everyone had already gone ahead a long time ago, and they could not catch up with them only because of Sangun. At this moment, the dark spirit was sucking the life out of the dead girls he had just killed and enjoying their youthful energy. He approached their face with his own face, and with the help of his mouth sucked out their souls. The old man at that moment bowed down to this evil spirit and called him the Great Sangvi. He asked the evil spirit if he liked everything and if he was happy with such a sacrifice. But the evil spirit asks him to throw the dead corpse of the girl onto the ground and says that he cannot be satisfied with such a gift. The evil spirit pulled out a yellow capsule from his tongue and said that such weak girls cannot be his rivals and he wants to find real nicknames who can fight him. The old man sweated with fear and said that there were still many Taoists left and the evil spirit would definitely like someone. And the old man asked the evil spirit to fulfill what he promised. But at that moment, the spirit simply broke the golden capsule with 2 fingers, and it scattered into many small pieces. He started to get very angry and said that he is one of the strongest spirits on this planet, and he always keeps his promises, unlike stupid people. The old man understood that it was impossible to quarrel with this creature now, and told him that everything was so, and he did not want to somehow offend the evil spirit. The demon began to walk forward and ordered the old man to immediately take him to other people because he doesn't want to hesitate because it tires him. He smiled and said that from now on the real hunt for stupid people begins. The soldier ran forward very quickly and tried to keep up with his prey. He screamed very loudly that he couldn't let her out of sight and needed to catch up with her. He and his partner surrounded the prey on both sides and tried not to miss it. One of the guys jumped up and swung his weapon over his head to strike. He hit the ground with his hammer with all his might and threw the creature aside. And the monster didn't like this blow, and after that he started growling very loudly at this guy and showed him his teeth. But at that moment, a sharp spear flew into his head and nailed him to the ground, not allowing this monster to get up. Their leader said that these soldiers were pathetic weaklings because they could not cope with him without his help. He shouted at them and asked why they were being so inattentive and said that you shouldn't underestimate your prey. The soldier turned to the senior student and said that they were finished with this monster, and the leader replied that this was good news and did not begin to discuss among themselves the price for which they could sell the dead bodies of this monster. But suddenly some strange monster appeared behind them, emitting very strong red energy. One of the guys shouted very loudly that they needed to be careful because a new opponent was approaching them from behind. An evil spirit was approaching them and looked very dangerous. They did not understand who he was, a person or a monster, and their leader replied that it was an evil spirit. The leader ordered his junior disciple to capture this monster and not let him leave here. After this, he made a rapid dash forward in order to pounce on his opponent. He hit the evil spirit with his weapon with all his might and split his body into 2 parts. The soldiers began to laugh because their leader was a real warrior who could deal with anyone. But after a few seconds, they did not see the terrible picture, as the evil spirit, with one blow of its claws, divided the body of their leader into 2 parts and cut off his head. The body of their leader fell to the ground, and now it was without a head, and the evil spirit continued to stand near his body. But after one moment, he pushed off the ground with his feet and disappeared somewhere. The evil spirit was already approaching the next enemy and wanted to cut his body with his claws. He said that these people are very slow. He pierced this guy's body with his hand and left a hole inside his chest. He pulled out yellow balls from the body of this warrior and asked this soldier if all his strength was in this ball and said that he was a real weakling. He looked at the other opponents and said that if this enemy has such a small ball, then the other opponents don't even have that much strength, and he feels sorry for looking at it all. The soldiers were scared after they saw that it was an evil spirit who made them partners, and they began to run away in different directions out of fear. The evil spirit began to laugh when he saw the fear in the eyes of these people. He said that even if they didn't want to run away, they still wouldn't be able to do it. In the forest, hunters found traces of some animal. There were a lot of traces in one place. The hunter put his hand down to touch these marks with his fingers. The girl approached him from behind and asked the older student what he had found. He turned his head back and told her that he wanted to install Huanjin here. She was shocked when she heard these words from him. She didn't understand why he wanted to install Huangjin in this particular place. He took the talismans in his hand and after that said that while he was here doing this, they must protect their territory. After that, he raised this talisman up and activated it, and a very bright beam of light appeared. This ray of light was so strong that it flew up almost to the sky, and after that began to create a certain protective barrier around them. The girl put her hand forward and said that Huanjin is installing here, and all the other servants should now mind their own business and not interfere with the senior student. He was completely focused on installing this talisman and ordered everyone to be on alert and not let anyone get close to them because there is someone else here besides them. Suddenly, in the fog that was in this area, silhouettes of some people appeared who were approaching them. One of the guys said that it was him, and he is 100% sure of it. He looked forward and saw in front of him some strange talisman that was sticking out of the ground and asked him if his name was Teho. After this, the guy said that they would be nearby, so there was no need to be afraid, and if he did everything correctly, he would be safe. And they told him that he could continue to collect his medicinal herbs, but should not go far. Sangun was unhappy that these people were constantly ordering him what to do, but he had no other choice because they actually thought that he was some kind of weakling. Fog appeared in the mountains, and it became more and more. The senior student continued to stand with his eyes closed, but at some point he said that this process was coming to an end. He raised his hand up and said that I don't know what's going to happen, and that's why he should be concentrated. Suddenly someone approached him and asked the senior student why he installed this artifact here because no creatures were visible here. And he immediately asked his partner if she had ever heard anything about Yoyukyohak. But from her reaction, it was immediately clear that she had never heard anything like that. He explained that this is a very evil spirit that has been living here since the time of Manbo, and at that moment, a mink appeared in front of them. The soldiers looked at this small animal in surprise and asked each other if such animals really lived here. He took out his weapons and said that he was bored just standing there. He wanted to glorify this little animal. The senior student explained that this spirit looks very cute despite the savagery and terrifying power that is inherent in it. And at that moment, the mink turned into a real monster that was able to progress the body into a warrior through and through. He started screaming very loudly because he saw his friend just kill a small animal. Sangun at this moment continued to search for medicinal herbs in this valley. But suddenly he heard some loud scream and realized that something had just happened to his allies. He turned his head and realized that something terrible had just happened to them because he heard them scream. He looked further and became interested in what happened there because of Huanjin, his samsara is starting to work poorly and he is not so well versed in space. The senior student said that there are evil spirits living here who don't care about these minions, and therefore you need to be very careful. Sangun suddenly realized that this place was actually inhabited by high-level evil spirits, and it could be very bad for the rest of the Taoists. He realized that if such a large number of evil spirits live here, it could cause a lot of problems, and suddenly he saw all these creatures in front of him. They were very angry and hungry, and their eyes glowed red and showed their fangs. Suddenly he saw how they all pounced on him and were ready to tear these people to shreds. Sangun saw this incredibly powerful force in front of him that was condensing over him, and realized that if these evil spirits possess the power of Huangjin, then there will be even more problems. Sangun knew very well that if someone fell under their attack, he would be cut into small pieces, and in the end he would simply die. He watched in horror as these creatures created a whirlwind of sharp blows that cut everything that came in their way. He did not have time to dodge this whirlwind and felt it approaching him and beginning to destroy him. These creatures were so strong that everyone who fell into their vortex completely died. All that was left was small drops of blood. But Sangun was not as weak as all these people who were with him, and therefore he managed to get his weapon in time and began to fight off his opponents. He knew that they did not underestimate him and had no idea how much power he actually had because his appearance could be deceiving to them. The girl said in a frightened voice that she did not know that there were such spirits as these and asked the senior student if they should leave this place. But the older students replied that they should not behave like cowards, and those who do not take risks do not drink champagne, so you can only fight against them with the help of Huan Jin. He narrowed his eyes, looked at her, and said that as soon as I don't come here, they will immediately be able to fight back, but they need to be vigilant. Sangun fought off all these little rats until he destroyed them all, and when he saw a bunch of corpses in these animals, he asked who they were because they attacked him so sharply that he killed them all out of fear. He was very surprised that such small creatures had such incredible power. He scratched his head with his fingers and said that all the servants who were with him died, and he doesn't understand what to do next because he doesn't want to stand here alone. But suddenly, he decided that no one sees him. He will take all these spirits for himself. But suddenly he stopped and felt that you were very strange next to him, as if he was not alone here. Sangun turned his head to the side and looked at this creature, after which he asked him in a rude voice who he was. In front stood the silhouette of some monster with long hair, and this monster had one eye that glowed with a bright white light. Sangun continued to look at this man and waited for him to come out of the wall so he could show his face. But suddenly he saw a guy from the Ping Gong squad in front of him and realized that this was actually not a monster, but just an ordinary Taoist. Drops of blood fell to the ground and created a pool of blood. A man threw up a ball wrapped in seals and played with this ball as with an ordinary ball. They stood on the edge of a cliff and were hard to see because of the fog that was in these mountains. One of the guys said that it was in this place that they installed Huangzhong, and this was probably a Taoist from the Pinggun detachment. The assistant looked at his leader and said that he did not know what to do next and was waiting for a command from his senior student. He thought a little and then informed all his subjects that they would go to attack them head-on. He said that some small obstacle had appeared and nothing had changed in a global sense, so they should just go forward and not pay attention to it. They began to run forward after their senior student, and he continued to tell them that if something happens, the battle will be between the squads. But this battle is inevitable. Their dark silhouettes slowly disappeared into the fog, which was covered like a blanket. The evil spirit was very angry about something, so he hit the ground very hard with his foot. The old man turned to the respected evil spirit Sangvi and asked him why he let these weak people escape. He smiled and said that he allowed him to escape because this way they would find the rest of the people and get together, and this would be much better for him than catching these pathetic people one by one. The old man looked at this evil spirit in surprise, and then said that those Huangzhongs that cannot see are created by people, and if they hide under it, it will be impossible to catch them. But Sangvi answered this old man that he had already thought out a plan for how he would deal with this, and grandfather shouldn't worry about it. He showed his hand from which at that moment a large number of centipedes crawled out and said that these were his little children who would help him cope with this. He ordered his little insect children to go ahead and find Huang Jin's cores. The insects listened to the order of their creator and then immediately went to complete tasks. He opened his palm and released all his insect children forward so that I could help him complete this mission as quickly as possible. Samgui smiled his nasty smile and again licked his lips with his tongue and said that the Huang Jin who protect these people will soon become the cemetery of these Taoists. The fog became stronger and stronger, and every minute it was less and less visible in front of us. The Taoist began to laugh and said that in order to avoid danger, he immediately rushed to Huang Jin, but met an ordinary private who knew nothing about it. He said that for some reason he was very unlucky today, but Sangun scratched his head and thought about what he had done wrong to him. But suddenly, the very people who wanted to kill him appeared next to them and did not mock the fact that he was able to escape from them. He looked at these people with a frightened look and could not believe that they were already here and did not understand how they could find him so quickly. Their leader began to laugh and asked this weakling if he really gave up so quickly and did not want to fight with him further. Sangong suddenly realized that these guys from the Daisang squad decided to attack another Taoist squad. But why did they do it? The senior student smiled, closed his eyes, and said that apparently his hour had struck, and death did not want to leave him, and as representatives of his squad, he would not run away and would accept this battle with dignity. After that, he pulled out his weapon and wrapped the talisman on his hand and said that the golden lichen is in this necklace. He put his sword forward and said that if they want to attack him, then they should not do it immediately. Sangong looked at the blue talisman that was on this guy's hand for a moment. He couldn't believe that there was a golden lichen there now. He narrowed his eyes and suddenly realized what was really happening. He realized that these people were hunting for this expensive item. At that moment, as they were busy fighting between each other, a scolopendra appeared and began to wrap itself around the protecting totem. The senior student stood in the center and was protected by 3 girls from his squad. But suddenly he felt something very strange and did not understand what had just happened. But it alerted him. The girl asked the older student what happened, and she replied that something bad was definitely happening now. He couldn't tell them what really just happened, but he felt a very strong energy of evil. He started looking around and saw that the sky had turned red, and the girl said that something was happening to their Huanjin. He shouted very loudly that someone wants to take over their protective totems, and something happened to the minions, and that's why they don't protect these totems. But at that moment, they tried to fight off the vile insects. But the problem was that no matter how much they caused damage and tried to cut them, nothing worked because these insects did not die. Sangun raised his head up and realized that some serious problems were happening now because he knew that the sky would never change its color just like that. The senior student also did not understand what was happening, and in an instant, everything that was next to them began to emit evil energy. But the leader of the enemy faction at that moment thought that this could be due to the fact that someone is trying to get out. But first, he still needs to get something else. He ordered his soldiers to prepare for battle, and they should all attack at his signal and at the same time kill the private who was standing next to him. But suddenly a red hand with sharp claws appeared behind one of the soldiers. It appeared out of nowhere. The rest of the soldiers heard a strange sound behind them and turned their heads back to see what was happening there. The evil spirit smiled and said in a satisfied voice that he was finally able to find them, and now he understood where they were all gathered, and at that moment he was strangling the weak soldier with his own hands. The leader of their squad could not believe that such a powerful creature was standing in front of him. It was absolutely not part of his plans. He ordered everyone to immediately leave and said that he would try to cope with this evil spirit himself, after which he took his ball wrapped in seals in his hand and began to defend himself. He created a fire barrier that prevented this hack from going through the arc and then threw a fireball at him. The soldier covers his face with his hands because the flash of fire was very large and it burned his face. He returned his ball back and then waited until the fire of Russia to see what happened to his past nickname. But the only thing they didn't see in front of them was a lot of fire and fog along with smoke, because of which they couldn't see them about the enemy. But this fire suddenly began to thicken in one place, and it was like a whirlpool. This whirlpool intensified with every second, became larger and larger, as if someone was controlling it with the help of some magical force. An evil spirit suddenly appeared in front of them from this fire, and said that he was already starting to like it, and he was surprised that this man had collected all the exploding spells and made a ball out of them. The warriors began to become very aggressive and angry when they saw that this disgusting creature was still alive, and continued to be insolent and joke at them. But the demon opened his hands, and then said that they could attack him right now, and he was ready to fight them all at the same time. The senior student was scared. He had never seen anything like this before, and now a real evil spirit in the form of a demon stands in front of him. Sangun said that this vile creature is completely red in color, as if it was made of blood, and it looks disgusting. But the demon at that moment hit one of the opponents with his hand and cut his body into 3 parts, after which he immediately died. When he dealt with one opponent, he immediately headed to the next one in order to destroy him, and Sangun at that moment drew attention to the 2 horns that were sticking out of his head and said that they looked terrible. One of the Taoists tried this demon with his big hammer and wanted to hit him on the head, but the demon was able to notice in time that I was attacking him. The evil spirit used 2 protective balls that were hidden in his hands and threw these balls in different directions. Thanks to the fact that he scattered these balls in different directions, he was able to immediately defeat 2 opponents who wanted to inflict damage on him. The leader of the squad was very angry, and he used his ball so that his most powerful spell hit the body of this evil spirit. He began to burn this evil spirit with the help of his fire and hoped that this would help him completely destroy it. He spent all his strength and energy to destroy this demon once and for all, and when he was completely powerless, he sat on his knees and hoped that he managed to do it. But he saw an evil spirit in front of him, who seemed to him to have received absolutely no damage and simply stood in front of him and looked at him as if he were prey. The senior disciple said that he could not believe his eyes because all the Taoists who had just fought against this vile demon were destroyed in protected seconds. But Sangun at that moment already began to understand what was really happening here, and the sense of danger increased several times. He looked at this evil spirit and said that this is one of the strongest evil spirits that exist in this world, and his name is Samgvi. When the demon heard this guy's words, he immediately turned his head towards him and looked at him. Sangun and the senior student at that moment felt a trembling all over their bodies. They were seriously scared because it's not every day that such a terrible creature looks at them. They understood that he was now approaching them closer and closer, and there was an urgent need to figure out what to do with him next. Sangun bit his lip because the skein stood up and was a little calmer, and he thought that he did not have enough strength to fight this monster, and he would simply die like the rest of the Taoists. He understood that he would not even be able to get out of this protective dome in order to simply escape from here. He suddenly made a sharp movement with his hand because he had a plan. Sangun sat down on one knee and bowed his head in front of this great evil spirit. He said that he admits his weakness in front of Samgvi. He thought that he didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that this evil spirit had the same origin as himself. Sangvi raised his head up and was surprised when he heard such words of subjugation from this weakling, and he became interested in playing with him. Sangvi stopped for a moment and looked at this guy. He said that he was a very interesting young man and was not like other people. But the senior student at that moment began to get angry and shout to the guy that he was a fool, because even if he was afraid, he did not have the right to worship an evil spirit. Sangvi scratched his ear because he was starting to get annoyed by the stupid grumbling of this useless man. He hit this man with his claws on the body with all his might and tore him to shreds. Samgvi asked Sangun if he really denied his human origin, and he renounced it so easily that he even became interested in communicating with him. Sangun saw how easily this evil spirit had just destroyed a person and couldn't believe his eyes. Sangvi looked at this guy and saw right through him. He said that there was now an animal sitting in front of him that hid among people and pretended to be a person, and he became interested in him. He looked at him with his demonic eyes and said that a war was developing between them and people. Because of this, many Taoists left their places and fled, but he was not able to resist these Taoists. He narrowed his eyes and looked at him with a dissatisfied look. He said that if they suddenly found out that he was a man, then he would be finished. Sangun tilted his head down and the evil spirit asked him why he came here and what he was looking for here. Sangun understood that if he made a mistake now, he would end up dead and die, and he simply replied that he was looking for the Sawal treasure here. Samgvi looked at him in surprise and pressed his lips to him. He became interested because he didn't think that this guy came here just for this. After that, the demon smiled and showed his sharp teeth to this guy. After a few seconds, he began to laugh very loudly and covered his eyes with his hand because he could not stop his laughter. He pulled out a large object made of jade from his mouth, and this object looked like a bowl, and after that the demon asked if this is what he was looking for. Sangun was shocked when he saw this item in the hands of the evil spirit and could not believe that he had it. Samgvi began to laugh and said that he could imagine that the tiger came here and turned into a man, but he could not believe that the stupid tiger came here for the sake of this object. Samgvi ordered him to be his warriors, and because of this he will pay him with this item, and this will be their agreement. Sangun couldn't believe that this evil spirit was now offering him such a terrible deal. The demon said that now his condition leaves much to be desired, but although he devours these powers of people, it costs nothing. He needs to return his former power. Grandfather at that moment was examining the bodies of the corpse, trying to find valuable things in them, and the evil spirit said that it would be better for him to be with someone who is closer to his origin than some vile old man of the human race. Sangun understood that there was no point in him thinking about this proposal, because if he refused it, he would simply die and he had no other choice. Sangun said that it was an honor for him to serve the Great Spirit, to which the demo replied that she was very glad that he agreed with his proposal. The grandfather approached the guy and said that he was very surprised that this guy also turned out to be an evil spirit who was pretending to be a person. But Sangun was very angry now and looked at this guy with his animal eyes. Grandfather smiled and said that no, he doesn't want this guy to look at him with that look, and explained that everyone has their own circumstances. He said that he worked 24/7 for 100 years for this moment to come. If there is hope that he can live a little longer, he will give this demon everything he asks for. After that, he smiled at the old man and said that that's all that worries him at the moment. Sangun continued to look at him with his dissatisfied gaze, and with all his appearance showed that he didn't like it all. Grandfather said that they must go forward because they cannot lose the way. If they lose it, they will then never be able to get out of here. The girl stood and looked at the red sky that was above her head. She was very scared because she had never seen anything like this before. It caused horror in her eyes. The senior student asked her not to worry about this because the center of Huangjiang is he, and he will defend it to the last. But unfortunately, he will not be able to hold out for long. He said that while he was here, she should go and check all the protective pillars and gather all the minions. But suddenly they heard the voice of this evil spirit, who told them that there was no need for this because he had already come here. He said that now they are the only living people left in this dome, and it is unlikely that anyone will be able to come here to help them. He broke this protective dome with his hand and said that no one could save them, and it was time for them to die. He could not believe that the center of the dome was destroyed with such ease, as if it was no problem for him to destroy this dome at all. The girl said that she would defend this place to the last drop of blood and struck the enemy with her sword in the hope that this would somehow help fight him off. But the enemy suddenly disappeared somewhere. A strong earthquake began around them, and a very large fog appeared that prevented them from seeing each other. The girl fell to the ground, but when she started to get up, she didn't see anything. She called the senior student in a voice to understand where. But when the fog in front of her, she saw a terrible picture, after which she could not breathe normally, and she became very scared. She saw in front of her the elder sister and the senior student. Their bodies were torn apart by this terrible monster, and the weapon that was in their hands was broken. She immediately started screaming in horror because she couldn't believe her eyes, and everyone who was next to her had just died in 1 second. But the evil spirit began to get angry because he was irritated by the vile scream and stupid girls, and he threw his fire sphere at her. She continued to stand and cover her mouth and hands because she was very scared and she didn't know what to do about it. But there was another defender nearby who immediately grabbed her weapon and pulled it out of its sheath. She stuck this weapon into the ground with all her might, and after that, ice began to appear around them, which surrounded everything. This ice began to envelop the yellow fire sphere that the demon threw at them. She used all her strength to create a barrier that would not allow this fireball to pass through it, destroy many of them. Her strength was not enough, and the ball still broke her barriers. She saw this fireball appear in front of her face and get closer and closer to her. No matter how hard she tried, she still could not cope with such a powerful sphere of fire, and this force defeated her, after which her hat flew to the side and splashes of blood appeared, and drops of blood began to fall to the ground, creating a puddle. She held her other hand with her hand, and tried with all her strength to stand on her feet, but her strength left her more and more. The demon was surprised when he saw that these 2 girls were still there. He couldn't believe that I couldn't cope with him. And despite the fact that he inflicted almost fatal damage on them and not everyone is still alive. Sangun looked at this girl and thought that she tried bravely to fight off the blow, but in the end she would not die from the hand of Samgvi. He started laughing and said that he was surprised because she was able to fight off his fireball and her soul was unusual. He looked at these girls and thought that if you are weak, you will definitely be eaten in this world. But it seemed to him that this was a stupid law of the universe. He heard the voice of a girl who said that if you came to Yongni Mountain, then you become the target of a stronger enemy. And at that moment he realized that he had heard this voice before and would never confuse it with any other voice. He looked at the girl who stood in front and was just defending herself against this demon and realized that he recognized her facial features. He took a closer look at her and recognized the white hair that was on her head and realized that this was the same girl he thought. Yes, it was that same little girl named Chow who constantly called him her husband, and now she is standing in front of him. He saw her blue eyes and immediately all doubts about her being that girl disappeared. He couldn't believe that Chow was now standing in front of him and looking at him, but he didn't understand what she was doing here and why she came. The demon was happy at this moment. He did not expect to see a girl of white blood here, and for him it was a real gift and he wanted to destroy her right now. Chow looked at this demon in fear and understood that he looked much scarier when he approached her. Sangun understood that he was now in a difficult situation, and he urgently needed to decide what to do next.